Hello guys, welcome to Soul Fiction. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto inherited the power of Seraphim Dragon? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. Skyfire at Dusk. The sea gave no room for lies that night. Wind tore the spray flat and hurled it sideways. The rain came in veins, and the ruins of Uzushio rose out of it like a skeleton that refused to lay down. Broken aqueducts scribbled across the cliffs. Their stone ribs bent toward the water, and through the hollows you could hear the old city breathing, all cavern and tide and echo. Naruto stood on the latest of those ribs, cloak plastered to his shoulders, and waited for the next wave to smash itself to froth so he could count the beats before it returned. 3 for low swell, 1 for lull, 2 to get the civilians across. He hooked his fingers around a frayed hemp guide and looked back. Hinata lifted 2 fingers in the rain. "Clear on the east stairs," she called. Her voice wasn't loud, but it threaded through the weather like it knew where the gaps were. 8 researchers, 6 villagers, 2 children. The walkway will hold for another 15 minutes. Maybe is plenty, Naruto said, and flashed her a grin that put heat in the miserable cold and made the nearest fisherman straighten a little. "Everyone you see, you move. 1 hand on the rope, 1 hand on the person behind you. Head down. If you look at the drop you'll think about the drop, and if you think about the drop you trip," one of the researchers muttered. "Right. Not looking, not thinking." They moved. Naruto stepped backward along the slick arch, bare feet choosing edges by feel, not liking sandals on this wet stone. Beneath him, the sea inhaled. He counted the beats, glanced to Hinata, and she was already watching the cliff lip where the gusts could bowl a person sideways. Her eyes had that Byakugan far focus. He'd learned to look where she looked, and he had never once regretted it. 2 old women had waded in their kitchen sandals through an ankle-deep flood that swallowed their street and were now glaring at anything that tried to tell them to do something. Naruto offered them an arm. They took it like a weapon. "Why is our village under attack?" One hissed as wind pushed her shawl out like a sail. "Because people who are scared of things they don't understand show up with metal and rules," Naruto said, easy. "We're not going to give them anything they want." "What do they want?" She asked it like she'd spit at it if she could see it. "People who make promises," Hinata said before he could answer. It should have sounded strange. It didn't. Not here with the storm old as salt laying hands on everything. Hinata kept her eyes on the stair and nudged a child's elbow in toward the rope. "Keep moving, sweetie. Almost there." They had arrived at dusk, and dusk had stretched until it lacquered everything in bruise colors. The mission had been simple on paper. Evacuate the academic expedition, sir. Veying Uzushio's lower vaults and recover any item flagged as dangerous by the sealing team. Dangerous meant anything that hums when people swear, jammed into a postscript like a joke. Naruto had laughed when he read it. He wasn't laughing now. Somewhere below the storm's roar, down in the ribs of the city, he could hear a thin, almost human keening that matched the rhythm of the footfalls around him. He didn't say the word artifact. He didn't say seraphim. He didn't say any of the words the elders had told him to treat like carrying glass in a crowded room. He breathed and moved and watched for the moment when the weather stopped being the only enemy. It came as a ripple in the dark across the far edge of the arch. Something precise moved where chaos should have been. Naruto didn't look right at it. He pulled his gaze a hand's width left and looked through the rain sideways, the way you watch a watchful cat. The ripple resolved into a human shape. It waited until 2 of the researchers stood at the point where the guide rope vanished into cracked stone, then stepped out like it belonged on air. "Hinata," Naruto said. "I see him," she said, and her fingers tightened on the rope. "It's not chakra. It isn't. The man was narrow where other men were broad, iron where other men were meat. His poncho hung straight in wind that bullied every other cloth on the cliff. His eyes were the color of scraped steel, not the glossy kind, flat sheet metal dead of reflection. He drew a blade that caught no light and held it underhand, mouth a patient line. He wore no headband. "Naruto Uzumaki," he said. He didn't shout. His voice walked the rain like it knew how. "Step away from the civilians." Can't, Naruto said, and smiled with all his teeth. They're very attached. Step away, the man repeated. And they will be allowed to leave. We don't need them. He touched the blade to a guide rope and the rope went slack before it fell. Whatever metal that was, it ate through hemp without chewing. Naruto looked down at the child nearest him and made sure the boy was watching his mouth. Hold tight, he said to the boy, and then to the man. You cut another rope and you go swimming with it. This arch will collapse within 7 minutes, the man said. Your rope won't matter then. Come away. The more you resist, the more people drown, Naruto Uzumaki. We aren't here for them. Then you're here for me. Naruto rocked on his heels. He felt the storm like a presence pressing against his skin, testing his balance. That's flattering. You have a name. Hazan, the man said. No honorific, no family, just Hazan. Naruto asked. What's the rest of it? Hazan the friendly. Hazan who hates rope. Hazan's face didn't move. Hazan of the Iron Choir. Hinata's knuckles went pale on the rope. Naruto breathed out through his nose. Never heard of you, he lied. Someone screamed behind them, the kind of scream a body makes when a foot goes where stone should be and finds nothing. Naruto didn't think. He moved. He left the rope with the smallest possible shift and the storm tried to eat him. He stepped anyway, a flat palm to the little boy's shoulder and a puss. That sent him against Hinata's hip in safety, and as his body tipped over the ark's lip he heard the scream again but closer and high with shock. A little girl pinned her fingers in the splintered railing and was stripping them bloody as the rain turned the stone to a slide. She slid toward the gap where the arch's rib had cracked straight through to rushing air. Naruto went after her. He didn't have chakra to spare for heroics. There were still 14 people strung across this spine of ruin who needed more than one man's ego. He fell into the air with that in his head, not big words, not history. He fell with a small one. The one that lived under everything else. I'll get you home, he said. He didn't shout it. He said it like he would say, pass the salt, at a kitchen table he wanted to come back to. The air under his feet went from cold to pressure and from pressure to shape. It thickened with heat, and the rain above it turned to steam that went white and honest around his calves. His foot found a step where there had never been one, and then another, like someone had been building a staircase in the sky and just needed him to decide to use it. He ran down nothing like it was a hillside. The little girl's fingers tore free. He was there a breath ahead of the fall, one hand grabbing her elbow so softly he didn't jar her, the other catching the back of her wet shirt. Her eyes were wide and furious with fear. Not the empty kind. She was mad it would end like this. He liked her immediately. He pivoted and the world resisted and then accepted, and hecklimed a ladder he hadn't built with the girl tucked to his chest. A blade kissed his shoulder where it had no business being. Hazan was suddenly there at the arch lip, and he had chosen that moment, that exact breath Naruto had most weight and least options. Naruto turned his body in the air so the blade took cloak and skin and not the girl. Fire went over his ribs, hot and cold at once. He didn't bleed the way he should have, or not at first. The water washed away what there was faster than it could leak. He put his feet on stone and handed the girl to Hinata. Hinata didn't scold him. She just nodded, once. And in that nod he heard everything she didn't say, all the things about staying alive and making the right stupid decisions at the right time. Then she was moving, the little girl's face tucked into her shoulder. Her other hand cutting through the air to direct the villagers forward. The Byakugan had gone pale white and far. He loved that look on her like most people loved sunrise. Naruto looked down at his palm. A thin feather of light burned there, a soft, pale gold that the rain couldn't put out. It lay under the skin, not above it, a ghost image with barbs and quill that ended in the meat of his hand. The heat didn't hurt, not yet, and under the heat was a sensation he didn't have language for, something like pressure coupled with rightness, like a bowstring at full draw that wanted very badly to be released. Hazan tilted his head. Rain slid off his hood in clean lines. So it's true, he said. You don't know what's true, Naruto said. He pulled the cloak off his right shoulder. In one quick twist and dropped the weight of it. The wound there smiled pink and ugly in the storm light. He slid his left foot out and put his hip in a place where he'd have an angle if Hazan came high. You can leave now. It gets uglier from here. We're not here to trade cuts. Hazan flicked his blade and the wet noise it made was wrong, like sound getting shaved. We're here to put down a risk. Then you should have brought your big boy boots, Naruto said. Hazan moved. Naruto didn't see muscles bunch or a lean telegraphed. One moment the man was 10 paces off, the next he was inside where a person's breath fogs your cheek. His blade came low, the backhand slash nobody uses unless they've learned distance weird. Naruto's world narrowed to the sound of rain and the shape of that metal the sensation in his palm that said he could ask for more if he asked true. He didn't. He adjusted. Foot and wrist, small choices. He let the blade ride his forearm rather than block it and then apped his elbow up so the blade missed something important. Hazan's other hand came up, a neat iron hook, cable-thin wire flicking from his glove like a second blade. Naruto bent and the wire touched the air and stayed there. A straight line in a place where nothing held straight. Feather steel. It set the hair up along his spine. He'd seen a sliver of that metal once, and even not knowing anything more than a rumor, he had disliked the way it didn't belong to the world around it. The wire smoked where raindrops hit it and didn't sizzle. They simply vanished. Back, he called over his shoulder. He didn't take his eyes off Hazan. Everyone, back, use the second stair. Hinata, I'm on it. Hinata already had the line of civilians moving. She didn't need him to tell her anything. That loosen. Something in his chest he hadn't realized was tight. Hazan's men revealed themselves in the rain, one by one, the way a kid pulls teeth out of a grin. They wore the same muted metals, the same unremarkable faces you'd forget at a market unless they were holding a knife, and they moved like they knew exactly what their blades would meet. They threw small discs down the atrium of the arch and the discs rolled in wobbling arcs and then clicked and the sound on the rock went thinner. Like a pause. The air felt like old cloth held too tight. Naruto took a small, quiet breath and tried to pull chakra, and the world told him no. Hush charges, Hazan said, almost friendly, as if you'd explain a good chess move to someone you respected enough to beat. You will find it difficult to cheat the physics we like. Cheat. Naruto flashed him teeth. This is me at my most honest. Hazan came again. This time Naruto met him. He stepped in and turned his shoulder, not to parry but to collide. He'd learned once from a drunken monk that sometimes you fight stronger by fighting closer, hips talking to hips, breath mingled. Hazan's blade kissed flesh again and Naruto gave flesh, the kind he could surrender, forearm and oblique. And in exchange he got angle. He shoulder-checked the man in a way you only get away with when you're young and rude. Hazan didn't stumble. He smiled, which made Naruto like him less. Your bluffing is good, Hazan said. You don't know what you are yet, but you use it like you do. Naruto set his feet and watched rain creep down Hazan's glove like it didn't know whether it was allowed. I'm a shinobi, he said. Same as you, just louder. A scream arced through the storm. Not fear this time, impact. The east stair sloughed a chunk of itself off and two villagers rode it halfway down and then found handholds by pure belligerence. Hinata launched into motion without looking back. Naruto saw it in the corner of his eye. Her palms open and precise, her Byakugan mapping stress fractures. Her body moving with certainty you can't teach, only earn by not dying a lot. Hazan flicked a disc up in his left hand, lazy as a street trick, and then kicked it across the RCH where it clanged against a projection and stuck. The circle lit from within with a pallid light that had nothing to do with chakra. The hush deepened. Naruto's skin prickled. Not fear, not weather. The part of him that had made air solid a moment ago felt caged. I'll hold, he said, to himself and because the shape of the words might matter. There wasn't time to think it through. He planted his palm on the wet rock and he'd rolled up his arm, a hot coal set in a good stove. Light went out in a circle around his fingers and returned, bent, like rain seen through steam. The air took on weight, gentle but firm, and the next gust came and broke horseshoe wide on an invisible curve and went howling away. He had meant to make a wall. He got a dome, weak where it stretched thin, strong where his hand pressed. One of the hush discs in the field's path shivered and turned black like bread left in the oven. The other burned on, indifferent. The dome trembled where it crossed the disc's radius. The tremble came up his arm like a pulled tendon. He grimaced and cut the shape smaller, not because he knew it would help but because Hinata had once told him, in another ruin, after another dumb rescue. That strength went up when you stopped trying to be everything. He pulled the field in until it cupped only the space where the line of evacuees had to pass. His hand shook the way it did after too much kunai practice. Hinata flashed by and dropped into a slide next to him. She didn't say, "How long can you keep it?" She put her fingers on his wrist, just above the bone, and her touch didn't feel like comfort. It felt like calibration. "Smaller," she said, not an order, a suggestion. "Hold center." He trimmed the dome again. The tremble lessened. The hush disc still buzzed like angry bees. He could feel the logic in it. Metal cut to a sentence, that sentence spoken into the world to make it obey. Hazan had brought the kind of weapon that didn't win by being sharper. It won by declaring victory and daring the world to argue. Naruto's lips twitched. "You brought a legal document to a fistfight," he muttered. "Pardon." Hinata glanced up, a smile lurking where it had no reason to be. Later. He swallowed heat and pulled the field tighter. "Go get them down. I'll keep my hand on this." She nodded and moved, pelvis low, knees soaked, shoulders ewer. Two men who had been brave up to now saw the shield and sped up and almost fell because speed and fear together make a kind of stupidity. Hinata hooked her hands into their belts and returned them to wise caution with a tug. Their gratitude wrote its own vow in the space between their bodies. Hazan had not tried to disrupt the line. He could have thrown steel into the crowd. He didn't. He watched the dome and watched Naruto's face. "You won't hold," he said, stating it like weather. "There are more of us. And you don't understand the cost of what you're doing." "Explain it to me," Naruto said, and wished one of the hush discs had legs so he could kick it down the cliff without lifting his palm. "You're binding yourself to a condition you can't control." Hazan twitched his blade and a net made of nothing but metal and stew. Bornus unfurled from the glove of his offhand. Every promise becomes a leash if the other end sits in a storm. Naruto laughed, and it surprised him a little, the sound of it. "You talk like you read a lot and never go outside," he said. "You should try it." Hazan threw the net. Naruto couldn't dodge without lifting his hand. He didn't. The net hit the dome and sparks leapt. Not light sparks but the cut kind. Slivers of air shaved thin. The net stuck and then began to saw its way through the field like an eel pushing through reeds. The dome bucked. The feather in Naruto's palm flared brighter and he tasted iron. He cut the shape smaller again and the net slid off, skirting the new curve, seeking purchase, failing. Hazan's face altered by the smallest degree, the way wind changes when it comes around the corner of a building. Not surprise. Consideration. Beyond them, Hinata shepherded the last of the researchers onto the east stairs. The two kids clung to each other's sleeves like tea. They had been practicing it their whole short lives. Naruto hated that they had probably been practicing it their whole short lives. He inhaled and felt his diaphragm push against the resistance like he was breathing inside a bell jar. This would not last. He let go of the idea of lasting. He held to the idea of enough. "Time," Hinata said, right at his shoulder again, voice made calm by effort. "We need to move, Naruto." He heard it. The arch was talking. Stone groaning inside stone. The hush discs ate at the structure same as they ate at chakra. Hazan's men shifted their weight back along the span like they were instinctively testing what would happen when it went. Naruto lifted his palm and the dome tore itself into rags of steam and vanished. The rain slapped him full in the face as if to complain that he had been holding it unfairly. He stepped forward into Hazan's space. He went not for a throat or a heart, though both were present and offered, he went for the hand with the net. He kicked low, shin to wrist. A shinobi's ugly trick, and Hazan's glove twitched and the net flared wide. Naruto caught one strand on a bare forearm and it bit through the top layer of skin. The pain was clean and immediate and expensive. He used it. He turned with it and dragged the net sideways so it cut at the place where the hush disc was glued to the rock. The metal line kissed the disc. The disc flickered dead. Hazan's eyes acknowledged him. For a second, two men were agreed on one thing. That had been good. "Go," Naruto told Hinata without turning. "East stairs. I'll meet you at Pelican's Mouth." "Only if you're there," she said. "I'll be there." He said it like he had said I'll get you home. The air under his feet remembered. He stepped as the arch broke. There was no clean fracture. The stone sagged in a slow sigh and then lurched, and then it was all movement. The line of civilians had just made the lip. Hinata folded herself around the rearmost person and used their weight to sling herself to a side ledge. Hazan didn't move. He stood 2 paces back from the break so he'd have time to make choices. Naruto dropped with the arch and used the fall to turn distance into a weapon. He had counted the wave beats all night. He knew when a lull would come. He knew this next trough would be longer than the last. He kicked off a sliding block and made 2 steps where no steps were. And the golden feather in his palm flashed strong enough that for a slice of time his own hand looked bone-lit from within. He grabbed the rusted metal of a once useful bracket, swung himself under the remaining segment of the arch like a boy on a river hoop, and let go. He landed on an outcrop he had no business reaching. He felt his ankle threaten to complain. He negotiated with it firmly. Anne's blade made a hiss in the rain, and then there were 3 men where there had been 2. Naruto's vision stuttered the way it does when you stare too hard at a spinning top. The second and third men were not illusions, they were his men. Their movements rehearsed to mirror his to the hair's breadth. They came in flanking. The way they moved looked like a choir singing in unison, everything tuned to one voice. Naruto understood suddenly why they used that name. He didn't give them the fight they had drilled for. He went sideways into the weather. Rain should always be your friend. If you fight wind, you lose. If you let it help you, you look like a god. Naruto turned his shoulder and the gust took him like they had agreed. He let it throw him past the right-hand flanker and got his knee between the man's thighs and the rock. He didn't kick. He posted hard. The man's leg folded with a wet sound that made the corners of Naruto's mouth go tight. The man didn't scream. He inhaled. Professional. The iron choir didn't break easy. Do you know what you're protecting? Hazan asked, calm in the chaos like the eye of something with rules. People, Naruto said. That's the list. The scroll, Naruto. The thing the scholars found in the flooded vault. You think you're keeping it away from us because you trust the leaf more than the iron choir. You don't even know what it does. You only know what you want to believe. Naruto blinked rain out of his eyes and set his foot in a crack so he could lever up if Hazan lunged. I know this. The last 3 groups who showed up with hushed toys ND Feathersteel left corpses behind when they went. The scroll didn't do that. Your choir did. He looked pointedly at the man clutching his broken leg. You brought a ledger to a storm. Your math's off. Hazan's mouth did something like wanting to be a smile and remembering discipline. He flicked his blade down and a tongue of that ugly metal bit into the rock at Naruto's feet and held, cable tight, a trip line that wanted ankle. Naruto responded by being where a foot should be and then not being there. He didn't jump. He simply didn't oblige. He couldn't keep this up forever. He didn't need forever. He needed 4 breaths. 3. 2. The rain shifted. The trough came. The sea inhaled and then hesitated, and in that hesitation a gap yawned in the white where a breaker should have been. Behind that gap he saw the black mouth of the sea cave they had marked on approach for exactly this scenario. Hinata, he shouted without looking, because he knew where she would be to hear him in. Because the storm had a habit of obeying sentences that believed in themselves. Pelican's mouth. Now, she didn't answer with words. She answered by launching a flare that wasn't a flare, one pulse of chakra bright enough in the thinning hush to register as a pale flower, and then the line of evacuees vanished into the cave mouth like they'd been planned there too. Hazan saw the same calculation resolve. He lunged. Naruto didn't parry the blade. He threw his forearm into Hazan's elbow to knock it off the line and then slapped Hazan across the face with his open right hand. It was such a dumb move that Hazan flinched a fraction. Naruto had used the move once before in a different alley against a drunk who needed to be rattled. He had used it on a man who could remove a rope from the world. It worked anyway. Naruto turned and ran. Running wasn't flight. Not tonight. Running was step 3 of a plan that started when he counted waves and looked at the cave and put the 2 together. He took the path that called him a fool, the one that launched him out along the last intact spine and then down into air again, trusting that he'd have heat under his feet when he asked for it. The feather in his palm burned like a little sun. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He spent it carefully. A step here where the rock gave nothing, another where a wave should have been but wasn't. Two more arcing over a chute that wanted to grind his bones. He landed on the slick lip above the cave mouth and rolled into shadow. The world went quiet the way it does when the sea gives you a corner to hide in. Hinata touched his shoulder and the touch was anger, not question. Everyone, he asked, already counting faces in the thin light. Everyone, she said. Bruises. No broken heads. She checked his side, swallowed once when she saw the blood, and didn't say the thing she could have. We still need the scholar's pack. The one with the cylinder. He glanced past her at the cluster of pale faces. The wide eyes of the kids, the set jaws of the men who were pretending their knees didn't hurt. One of the researchers clutched a canvas sack like a holy thing. Naruto nodded to him and the man half stumbled forward. Water dripped in a steady metronome from the cave roof. It hums, the researcher said, voice small and embarrassed by the word. We thought it was the wind through the tunnel, but it isn't. It hums when someone swears, Naruto said. All at once the feather in his palm wasn't a neat image. It was a fact wrapped around a heartbeat. He met Hinata's eyes. She had felt it too. The way the world had leaned toward him when he said I'll get you home, the way the air had consented when he said I'll hold. Consent wasn't the right word. Response. Partnership. Let me see, he said. He kept his voice easy. Gentle. The researcher opened the sack like he was afraid it would bite. Inside lay a cylinder of black stone banded by rings of metal so old the metal had forgotten it had ever shone. The stone was not glossy. It had the mad dignity of river rock. As Naruto reached for it, it did not glow and it did not speak. It hummed a little like a throat wanting a song. The pitch climbed half a tone when his fingers touched it. He picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been. Don't promise anything you can't keep, Hinata said softly. He smiled with his mouth. Not his eyes. I won't. A cable whistled down out of the dark and bit the rock a breath from his ankle. The iron choir had found the secondary entrance. Of course they had. You don't carry hush discs and nets that ignore wind and forget to learn caves. Hazan's voice came from the tunnel behind them, and this time he did not bother walking his words through rain. They came straight. You know what you're carrying, he said. You can feel it. That thing doesn't love you. It loves your certainty. You feed it and it feeds you. We're here to keep that loop from ending the world you think you're saving. You ever notice, Naruto said, hefting the cylinder in one hand and rolling his shoulder to feel where the wound would bite when he needed it to not bite, how everyone who says, we're here to save the world brings weapons that take people apart. We bring weapons that take apart lies, Hazan said. Then you're in the wrong cave, Naruto said. He turned and put his back to the slick stone and let himself breathe once. Hinata, I'm here. She touched his wrist again, quick, and the pressure of her fingers on the veins slowed his heart by a half beat. He didn't know she could do that. He filed it away under things Hinata can do and will use when they matter. The tunnel behind them narrowed before it bent. If Naruto could set the dome there. No, not the dome. Not again. Smaller. He looked at the cylinder and thought about plates and bowls and things meant to hold. He tapped the stone with his thumb the way you test a melon for ripeness and the hum. Ming answered in a way that felt unreasonably like pleasure. He set the cylinder on the cave floor at the elbow of the bend. If any of you can run, run, he told the evacuees. Follow the light. Keep your hand on the wall. Take turns holding that kid so nobody's arms give out. If you're hurt, you get to delegate. He didn't bark it. He offered it like a route card for hikers. People do better and you give them a map instead of a shove. The fishermen were already moving. The scholars followed, their fear smart enough to pick up its feet. The kids were carried like prizes. Hinata took the rear, for 5 steps and then slid past Naruto to the elbow of the bend and planted her feet shoulder width and cut her hands through the air as if it owed her something. If you're going to do something stupid, she said, not looking at him. Do it now and keep it small. That's my whole charm, he said, and reached out with his left hand because his right had the feather scar and some part of him NTED to see what would happen if he didn't lean on the same magic twice. He made a shape with his fingers like he was holding a cup. I'll be here when you come back, he said. The words came easy. They were not a vow to the world. They were a thread to Hinata. Heat gathered, but not in his palm this time. It gathered in the space between his hand and the cylinder. Air turned thick, and that thick. Ness did not care about hush discs or feather steel. It cared about the shape of an intention. He let the shape be modest. He did not try to wall off the tunnel. He cupped it. A shallow, shimmering bowl of pressure formed and held. Just enough to catch anything Hazan threw and make it slide sideways into rock. Footsteps approached. Not many, not clumsy. Hazan allowed the first two of his men to enter the bend, then stopped. He saw the shimmer. He didn't test it with his hand. He flicked a pebble. The pebble hit the air, made a different sound than it should have, and skittered into the wall. He exhaled, not pleased, not displeased. A man who liked variables being counted. Do you think you're the first to find a way to use that? He asked. No, Naruto said. I think I'm the first who's going to use it the way it wants. Hazan clicked his tongue. It wants what you want. And you want to be necessary. He shifted his weight. The feather steel blade whispered against stone. You keep saying you'll get people home. You ever wonder if one day you're the reason they left? Naruto didn't answer. The wound at his ribs throbbed. The feather in his palm dimmed a little. He watched the bowl hoe. LD as the first Iron Choir soldier tested it with the tip of his blade and found himself redirected without malice. Naruto almost smiled. It was such a gentle defense. It didn't forbid. It refused to cooperate. The scroll, Hazan asked. Half of it, I think. The other half is down there. He nodded deeper into the cave. Even if you keep that piece, the tune will finish elsewhere. Then we'll go elsewhere, Naruto said. You can come, if you leave the hushed toys. A pause. The sound of rain was a memory out here, filtered through rock. Hazan's breath did not fog. The air around him knew better. You're not wrong, Hazan said. And this time there was almost warmth under the metal. You look around, you see people. It's admirable, but you're also a hazard. People like you always are. We exist for that exact hazard. We don't hate you, we anticipate you. Naruto didn't bristle. Something in the frankness earned frankness back. You're not as special as you think, either, he said. People have been promising each other things and keeping them longer than your choirs add a name. You couldn't stop that on your best day. Hazan rolled his shoulder like a man loosening a knot. We don't stop it, we manage it, but you're right about something. He lifted his hand and checked his fingers like he was counting. This isn't a day I get to win. The man in front of him blinked. Naruto almost did too. It is not the habit of people who brand themselves Iron Anything to admit they're not about to win. Hazan slid a disc forward on the cave floor with his toe. The humming under the cylinder climbed a note. Naruto felt the shape of his bowl wobble, not destabilized, just asked a question. He answered by letting the edges of the cup collapse a finger's width more toward the center. Smaller, stronger. Hinata's presence at his side steadied the idea. Hazan listened to the sound of the civilians, footsteps fading into the good dark. I'll come for you again, he said. You'll have fewer civilians to hide behind then. Naruto's head tipped. He almost said the obvious thing about hiding. He didn't. He looked at the man who had refused to cut through fleeing people when he absolutely could have. Who had thrown a net at a shield instead of a child, who had chosen to be patient in a storm that punished patience. I'll give you an honest fight when there aren't kids in the room, he said. That's a promise. Be careful, Hazan said softly. His gaze flicked to Naruto's palm, to the feather burned under the skin. Those are the ones that cost. He pulled his men back with a twitch of his wrist, a conductor cueing rest. They faded into the tunnel's black with the same lack of friction they'd dropped out of the rain. Naruto held the bowl while the last echoes of their leaving became cave breath again. Then he let the shape go. The pressure in his body unspooled slow. He reached for the cylinder and tucked it back in the canvas sack like you put away a dangerous kindness. Hinata was very close. She watched his mouth the way he watched hers, and when he finally relaxed his shoulders she touched his wrist one more time. If you promise the whole world, she said, something like humor at the edge of her voice. I'll make sure you can keep it. I'll start smaller, he said, and then grinned, sudden and honest because he was too tired to polish it. I promise I'll sit down in the next 5 minutes and drink water. Quote, "That one," she said, "is my favorite." She dug in her pack and produced a battered canteen. She didn't let go of it when he took it. Their fingers overlapped a second more than necessary. The heat under his skin shifted from hard to warm. They moved. The cave led them through a black so thick it felt physical, then up, always up, until the lung of the sea opened into a throat and the throat into a mouth that let them out under a lip of rock fringed with dripping ferns. Night had finally decided to be night. The storm had burned out some of its temper and settled into a steady slap of rain that felt like being forgiven for something. The villagers peeled away once safety had a shape they recognized, a ridge path with scrub on one side and not really death on the other, and the researchers clumped like sheep until Hinata split them into smaller groups and made each group responsible for the next. Responsibility, Naruto had learned, kept panic from gnawing through the bottom of a person. They reached a shelf under an overhang and let their bodies be heavy. Naruto pressed his back to stone and let himself inventory his pain like a miser counting new coins. He had the cut along his ribs, shallow but stubborn, the forearm line where Feathersteel had written its name on him, and that weight in his palm that wasn't injury but would become one if he pretended it wasn't there. He turned his hand over in the dim and watched the feather glow fade and return with his pulse. You could have mistaken it for a trick of light if you wanted to. What is it? The smaller of the two children asked, brave now that bravery wouldn't get him killed. Bad tattoo, Naruto said. The boy looked skeptical. Do you get to pick the picture? Not this one, Naruto said. He looked at Hinata. She shook her head minutely. Not here. Not now. He wasn't going to, but it felt good to be seen not doing it. He poured water over his forearm and hissed when the cut woke up like a cat realizing the bath was not, in fact, over. Hinata took the canteen and a cloth and moved his hand out of the way with that careful economy she had, respect for the thing and for him in the same motion. Hold still, she said. He held still. Iron Choir, one of the researchers blurted. Who are they? Mercenaries. Missing ninja. People who don't like what they can't legislate, Naruto said. People who think if something feels like belief, it's going to ruin their day. They said they were saving the world. The man laughed without any humor. So does everyone. Not everyone, Hinata said. She tied off a neat bandage and patted it once like she was telling it to behave. Some people just save the person in front of them. Naruto looked at the canvas sack. We're not done, he said. We have half a song and the other half is down there. Hazan's going to move it up the chain. He glanced out at the smear of the horizon. Lightning walked the far line like a slow animal. And there's always a chain. Can we get word to Suna? One of the fishermen asked. Arkumo. Anyone who hates the choir more than we do. We'll choose who we put in this, Naruto said. He made a face, thinking of politics. Sand smoothed and sharp. But yeah, sand's good tonight. Wind's with us. He let the thought hang there so it didn't turn into a speech. His eyelids wanted to be coins someone else shut. Hinata tapped his shin with the toe of her sandal. Sleep, she said. 3 hours. I'll take the first watch. You hate the first watch, he said, surprised into a small smile. I lick. Hearing you breathe before you forget to, she said matter of fact, and then colored, just a little, because sometimes honesty arrives wearing no coat. I mean you'll sleep better if. Hinata, he said, soft. Thank you. She ducked her head and laughed under her breath. Just drink your water. He did. He salted himself a biscuit of jerky the way you do when you're pretending something is food. And chewed until he had put the day behind him enough to think about tomorrow without it looking like a cliff. He lay down with the canvas sack against his hip, because sometimes old habits are better than locks. And let the sound of rain own the edges of his mind. The feather under his skin cooled. He did not dream words. He dreamed the sensation of stepping into air and finding it knew his weight and wanted to hold it. Far out on the broken aqueduct, on a rib of stone that would be gone by morning, Hazan stood with his hood down and rain writing lines in his hair. He flexed his left hand. He glove stitching had opened where Naruto's slap had knocked sense out of ritual. He looked at the split with the same detached interest he'd looked at the hush disc with. Then he moved his hand and the glove stopped bleeding water. Because of course it hadn't been bleeding to begin with. A figure waited in the lee of a toppled archangel statue. It wasn't a statue, not in any real sense, just tea. He suggestion of one the sea had been gnawing for years. The figure had chosen that spot as if it meant something. Hazan didn't ask what. It made no difference. You let him go, the figure said. Its voice was pleasant the way metal can be. If you like knives. He wasn't mine to keep, Hazan said. He noted in the same breath that if he said it that way enough times, he'd start to believe it and that would be dangerous. Did you get it? The figure asked. Half, Hazan said. The other half we'll fetch. He paused. You measured words because they were currency and because wrong words came back later wearing bills you couldn't afford. New. He makes air where air wasn't. And the response to his speech patterns is significant. Ah, the figure said. Vowel resonance. Hazan didn't nod. Don't say that like a prayer. It'll get ideas. You doubt. There was amusement there. It ignored the rain. I don't doubt, Hazan said. I prepare. He watched lightning walk out at the horizon in other time and thought about the boy's hand and the feather burning under the skin where a promise had written itself into meat. He thought about the moment in the tunnel when he'd looked across a small, stubborn shield at a shinobi who had cut his shape smaller and stronger and decided not to break it with brute force because brute force would kill the wrong people. He promised me a fight, he said. Then we'll collect, the figure said. Soon. Hazan didn't answer. He tasted rain. He reached up and touched a place on his cheek that stung in a clean line where a slap had landed like they were in a bar somewhere and he had told a joke that didn't land. He laughed, out loud and small. It was the first honest thing he had done all night that didn't feel like work. Back under the rock, Naruto turned in his sleep and the feather flickered like a candle that had decided to be patient. Hinata sat with her knees up and her arms around them, dark eyes on the mouth of the cave. When the small R of the two kids got up to pee and pretended he wasn't scared of the dark, she lit a tiny glow in her palm, the kind nobody would see from outside, and held it up like a star only one person was allowed to own. The boy did his business with dignity. He went back to his sister like a soldier. The hum from the cylinder matched Naruto's breath rate and then shifted half a beat slower, like something learning how to rest. Hinata looked at it and looked away and chose to make her world small enough to keep. She named the wind patterns by habit, and when her mouth moved she said nothing like, I'll keep you. Because that's not how this kind of night works. She said, I'm here, and meant it. The rock listened. The weather listened. The future listened, too, but only because it was nosy. When dawn finally came, it didn't break clean. It seeped. The sea went from black to deep bruise to something like certainty. The storm had left the sky looking washed and embarrassable. Naruto woke at the econ breath of not night and sat up like someone had called his name in a room where he knew everyone. He touched the sack to make sure the cylinder had not decided to teach itself to walk. It hadn't. He rubbed his palm with his thumb and felt the ghost of the feather, softer now, not gone, never gone. He looked at Hinata. Breakfast? He asked, working the grit out of his voice. You're lucky, she said. A crab decided to die foolishly near us. He laughed softly. It knew the company. She arched an eyebrow. Iron choir. Us, he said. He slid down the ledge to where the ridge path began. Below, where the storm night had chewed the city into hunger, waves sucked at stone with an old married intimacy. He let his eyes travel the broken geometry of the place, the lines where aqueduct had once met reservoir. The long tilted columns that had held up civic pride and now held up gulls. He didn't feel like claiming. He felt like greeting. Good morning, he said to the ruin, because it had hosted them without swallowing them. And to the sea, because he had stepped on it last night, and to the dragon he hadn't said out loud because names were sometimes a kind of door. The hum in the sack didn't answer. His hand did, a little, with warmth. We have a day, he said to Hinata when she joined him with a crab leg and two fish someone had been competent enough to catch with a line of thread and patience. And a choir to out-sing. Hinata's mouth turned thoughtful. And friends to ask for help, she said. She didn't need to say the names. He thought of wind that could be carved like wood. He thought of blue fire that liked order. He thought of a priestess who had once told someone she was tired of calling things before they deserved it. He thought of a future that could be played like a song if the players trusted each other to take the next note. He cracked the crab with 2 fingers and felt alive enough to admit that the pain at his ribs made the air taste sharper and more interesting. "Let's begin," he said. And the day agreed. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. Feathersteel and Sand. The desert wanted to tell jokes about people who thought they understood distance. Naruto learned its humor by the 3rd hour. Everything looked a palm's breadth away until you started walking, and then the world took 3 steps back for every one you took forward. Heat rose off the glass wastes in slow breaths, turning the horizon into a rumor you could never quite prove. Hinata tied a scarf across her face and let her eyes go pale. She said the heat was like fog through the Byakugan, all Hifting mirage layers that hid the bones of the land. He believed her. He kept his attention on where the wind had combed the sand into lines that meant easier going. The canvas sack thumped his hip with every step, a polite reminder. Soon as outer sky yard appeared the way good cities do in the desert, suddenly, like a ship cresting a wave. Low walls, windbreaks, a net of glinting wires strung between poles to sing away some of the heat, and on a raised platform a woman with a fan tall as she was, hunting the horizon with an expression normally reserved for math. Tamari saw them before the gate watch did. She didn't wave. She tilted the fan to angle wind across the yard and the heat's teeth loosened a little. "You're late," she said when they were close enough to hear her without shouting. Or the sun moved. "Either way, welcome to my least favorite kind of day." "Hi," Naruto said, cheerful because sometimes you put a bright flag on a hard moment and the moment softened. "We brought you something that hums at bad times." "Just what I wanted." Temari's eyes flicked to Hinata, taking in the sand goggles, the straight shoulders, the pale veins of chakra gathering like quiet lightning. Approval sharpened her mouth. "You must be Hyuga Hinata." Then back to Naruto. "And you're the one who scandalized 3 Wind Rangers by running on air in a storm." "I'd ask how, but you look like the kind who does before he explains." "I can explain after," Naruto said. "If we're alive." Tamari nodded. "Good. I like you already. Come inside before the yard bakes us into snacks for vultures." The cool in Suna is not cold. It's the kind of relief that makes your bones decide to forgive your skin. Temari's office smelled like dry ink and old lacquer. She unrolled a strip map as they drank brackish water that tasted wonderful because it wasn't heat. The map showed the glass wastes beyond Suna like a network of veins, all hazard and wind-spoken paths, and a dotted line arcing across it that made Naruto's skin itch. "That," Tamari said, tapping the dotted arc, "is the route used by caravans that are only caravans if you don't look too hard. They leave from the South Depot at night, they cross the wastes when the heat won't pull them apart, and they arrive at the northern relay right before first light. They carry ore, water, and, this week, something I don't like the smell of." "Hush discs?" Naruto asked. "Feathersteel." "Maybe," Tamari said. "Maybe not. The manifests are very clean, which is how you know they're lying." She rapped her knuckles on the table. "We intercepted a whisper out of Wind's embassy 2 days ago. A buyer with Iron Choir code slang contracted a mobile foundry to cross the wastes. The words, 'won't show on chakra site,' were used. I'm assuming they weren't bragging." Hinata leaned in without lowering her scarf. "Mobile foundry. Looks like a supply caravan until it stands up," Tamari said. "You think of it as craft and cage at once. You throw your ore in and it comes out trained to ignore the way the world is supposed to work." Naruto pictured the hush discs in the cave and the way the air had gotten thin around them like someone had taken a poem and scraped the rhyme off. He didn't hide his jaw tightening. Tamari noticed, because she noticed things. "So," she said lightly, "you know the smell. Great. I don't have to explain why I'm bored of it." "Where's the relay?" Naruto asked. "Mountain base," Tamari said, pointing at a row of toothpicked peaks out past the glass. "We call it the saw. Lightning's side of the border claims it when they want to flex. We claim it when we need to be annoying." Naruto looked at the canvas sack. The cylinder inside hummed faintly like it preferred to be useful. He touched it through the cloth. He could pretend it was simple. He didn't. "We need to steal like we mean it," he said. "And not let anyone die under a wheel." Tamari watched him for the weight under the words more than the words. Then she grinned, quick and interested. "We have a plan, then. Perfect. Step 1. You don't do that thing where you decide your body is a rope bridge. Step 2. When you disobey step 1, do it where I can use it. Shish. Flicked the end of her fan closed and drew lines in a dish of sand on the table. We'll hit them here. The ground makes them bend into a single file because of a glass ridge, and there's a leeward pocket I can turn into a wind corridor. Hyuga, you'll do my eyes and, judging from your reputation, make sure we don't walk into a fake ground. Hinata's mouth curved. We're very anti-fake ground. Temari blinked. That earned the first of her private laughs, the ones that showed mostly in the corner of her eyes. Good. Naruto, you get in, you make a mess that sounds like a gear deciding it loves freedom, you get out. We take the foundry's heart. Nobody under the wheels. Her gaze ticked down to his right hand. What's wrong with your palm? Bad tattoo, Naruto said, same tone as the night before. Does it help? She asked. He opened his mouth and closed it. Sometimes. Don't use it unless you need it, Temari said. The desert is greedy. It asks for water, and then it asks for more. She stood. We leave in an hour. The wastes aren't the kind of place you sneak through. They're the kind of place that either wants you or doesn't. Temari made them wanted. She bent wind without making it showy, small pressure differences. And almost music that took the sting out of the air and made the sand crust stick together just when Naruto's boots wanted it to give. Hinata paced on his left, ND occasionally touching his sleeve like a metronome. They walked hunched when dunes were wise and straight when the ground liked it. The caravan appeared as torchlight first, a string of amber beads laid across the night. Then the shapes behind the beads revealed themselves as wagons too broad to be friendly. Men and women walked alongside in veils and goggles, their steps exactly matched, a choir in another key. Naruto's knuckles went warm. Temari breathed out. Pretty, she murmured. Disgusting. He saw it a heartbeat after she did. The middle wagons weren't just riding. They were unfolding. Panels flipped on hidden hinges. Axles telescoped. The steel under an ordinary skin unrolled itself into an insect with iron legs, and the entire caravan stood like a thing that had been pretending to be less than it was. Heat rolled off it when the crucibles lit, the kind of heat that flattens the tongue. Naruto felt the feather under his skin twitch toward the fire like a falcon hearing the bell. Pretty, he agreed. Disgusting. Quote. Hinata's eyes went pale again, veins fattening at her temples. There, she said softly, pointing. A hush cool. They've sunk discs into the sand. If you step wrong, your chakra will pretend it never met you. Copy, Temari said. She shifted her grip on the fan. Naruto, I'll be careful, he said, and meant it. The ambush was never going to be a quiet thing. Temari blew the first signal like a kiss. Wind lifted the leeward pocket into a corridor that ran along the caravan's right side, a clean, temporary avenue. Naruto ran into it and felt his body get more efficient. The air shouldering him like a friend. The first guard turned, eyes narrowing in a way that said he had been told to expect trouble but had not believed it could be clean. Naruto didn't waste a line. He went low, swept a knee, palmed the man's shoulder so he fell backward instead of under his own weight, let the weight go where it wanted, down and out of the corridor, not into the gears. He didn't count that as mercy. He counted it as staying on plan. A hush disc clicked alive under his next step. He felt it like a door closing in front of his face, some part of himself being asked to wait outside. He changed his footfall midair and landed sideways on a stanchion. Hinata's voice came sure and quiet. Left, then right, then straight. He ran her words and found the safe. Stones in a world that had suddenly decided it didn't want him to have techniques. The foundry groaned like a sleeping animal made to wake too fast. Naruto jumped onto a crossbeam and it sang. He used the song to time his next lunge, reaching for the line of gears that spun heat to where it shouldn't go. He didn't have time to be perfect. He made the decision you make when you can't be perfect. He was precise instead. I'll break only what we need, he said. The feather in his palm warmed. He cupped his hand around the air like a man trying to hold a bowl of water without a bowl. The air answered, subtle, tight, sharp at the lip. He used that lip like a tool and cut, not with a slash but with a press, like separating two glued pages with a fingernail. Metal complained. A gear pinion sheared, with a noise he would hear in a toothache later. He didn't name it then, but he'd remember it later as pinion shear. The forge stuttered. The wagon's legs buckled a degree. Workers shouted. Someone threw a hush disc blindly. Naruto ducked and it struck one of their own crucibles and went dead with a little apologetic click. Fire licked free. The world smelled like stone, remembering it had once been sand. Tamari appeared in a slice of the night, her fan carving a line that Wind agreed was clever. She did not look at him. She looked at the path the spilled fire wanted to take and ruined the path with Wind so that it ran somewhere harmless. Next, she said, bland. Naruto grinned helplessly at her tone. It steadied him in a way he didn't know he needed. Hazan stepped into the corridor. The YA knife enters a sheath that belongs to it. If he had been surprised to see Naruto again so soon, he didn't wear it. He had swapped his poncho for a harness that bristled with spools. Thin filaments, blacker than night, whispered off the spools and climbed into the air like cobwebs deciding to grow spines. Hello again, Hazan said. Suna looks good on you. I'm trying new outfits, Naruto said. You look like a loom. Hazan's mouth ticked. You cut our toy, he said, eyeing the shuddering pinion. Nice thinking. So here's mine. He twitched his fingers. The filaments rose and no longer tended to be anything but what they were, wires that required the air to straighten itself around them. They anchored to points that weren't there a moment before, fixed geometry in a world that should not have had any. Naruto's next step ran into that geometry. He felt the air under his foot go from soft friend to hostile ruler. Feathersteel, Hinata breathed, not quite a curse. Anchored, Tamari said, dispassionate because naming panic makes it worse. He's stapled the wind. Naruto tried to lift and found his ankle arguing with a line he couldn't see. Hazan's blade came. Naruto gave himself no breath to resent the trick. He dropped instead of rose and the blade went where his throat had been. He rolled under the foundry's belly, where the belly's heat turned everything into a low oven. The filaments were fewer because nothing liked to anchor to a glow this hot. Hazan followed. Of course he did. He carried his rules wherever he went. He slashed once to test the space, twice to mock. Sad work of a piece of chain that had a family, and then he was in Naruto's breath again. The hush discs in the sand made the bottom of the world slick and quiet. Naruto's body wanted height and got a crawlspace. He made a decision because decisions are sometimes all you have. He stopped trying to be a bird. He became a man who liked lever arms. The foundry's leg above him creaked. It was a joint. Joints need counterforce. He set his back against a spar and planted his feet against another and used himself like a jack, not to break anything this time but to hold the leg an inch higher where a worker had a hand. The worker who wasn't iron choir, not everyone here was choir, tried to yank free. He had no leverage. Naruto said, I've got you, not loudly and not as a performance. The leg trembled and put more of itself on him. His teeth met and stayed met. Heat crawled under his skin wanting to be used. He didn't let it fling wide. He made it tiny and stubborn. No one under this wheel, he said. It didn't light the sand. It made his back capable. The worker slid free with skin left behind and scrambled out. Hazan's blade nicked Naruto's ear. He used the sting to find the edge of the blade by feel. He drove his temple into Hazan's shoulder and Hazan let him because sometimes letting a man take a small hit gets you a better one later. Temari's wind cut through the foundry's leg. Like an idea that changed a conversation. She wasn't trying to topple, she was trying to interrupt. She ruined the filaments, angles by making the air refuse to be flat where they needed flatness. Anata called lines through the heat in quick, calm syllables, and everyone moved as if the words were handholds. Naruto slid out from under the machine and came up in a crouch. Hazan was there, Alred. Why compensating for where Naruto was going to be before Naruto chose to be there? The blade fell and Naruto let it cut where it would hurt later, not now, meat, not movement. He flicked his wrist, grabbed the nearest spool of filament, and pulled. Feathersteel cut through leather and then through finger before it agreed to tear off its metal anchor. Hazan didn't cry out. He stared at his hand like T was a new report he hadn't had time to read. 2 of his fingers were shorter than they had been. The ends were too clean. The missing pieces struck the sand and vanished into the hush. Hazan said, neither displeased nor pleased. He flexed what he had left to learn it. The motion sprayed a handful of clean red that the desert drank like a connoisseur. Useful. You're a problem, Naruto told him. So are you, Hazan said. The difference is I know who writes my orders. A hammer rang somewhere deep in the machine as if offended to have its workplace interrupted. Naruto didn't look away. You don't look away from a man who likes feathersteel. But he threw his voice back. Hinata. Temari. On my mark, drop the foundry onto its knees. Copy, Temari said. Whose knees? Mine, Naruto said, because sometimes stupid was the right shape. He breathed twice and tasted heat and hot iron. The feather in his palm brightened once like a heartbeat deciding. Now, Wind forgot to hold the right legs. A gear Naruto had cut with subtlety decided to remember what subtlety was for. The foundry's body dropped a half cubit, and in that lurch every feathersteel filament lost the exact tension it needed. Naruto felt the air loosen around his ankle, just enough. He took one step the size of a whispered apology and all at once he had angle again. He brought his hand up in a short, clean arc. Not a blast, a press. The shear kissed the spool assembly at Hazan's chest. Metal parted with a beautiful lack of drama. Hazan stepped back 3 paces so the shear didn't meet anything he wanted to keep. He regarded the ruined spool like a student looking at a chalkboard with a new symbol on it. You're improving, he said. The words weren't mocking. If anything, they were assessment. It's wasteful to kill you too soon. Kind, Naruto said, but you're not in charge of the schedule. A shout went up at the rear wagons. Hinata had climbed somewhere impossible and was now reaching down with bow. Hands to haul a woman out of the fire path. Temari had turned the air into a chisel and was carving a trench for spilling metal to cool in without eating anyone. Sand shinobi in neutral veils, Temari's people, swarmed in. Tying hands where ties needed tying, knocking down guards who had decided to make this about dying for a large box. Naruto dropped off the beam into the belly of the foundry proper. The heat hit like an embrace from a relative you don't like. He kept his eyes on the moving parts, not the glow. You survive hot rooms by looking where the pain isn't. He found the control box by the stupid little brass plaque that said safety in 3 languages. Bureaucrats can't help labeling. He pried the box open and stared at the guts and snorted. The schema wasn't a plan. It was a language. He didn't try to read it whole. He took a picture of it with his hands. He lifted out what he could without killing the men who might be under the wrong thing if the wrong thing stopped wrong. He found a tube built of layered metal leaves, the kind of thing you use to make very precise heat behave, and a stack of thin sheets where some poor genius had written proof that he hated sleep. He stuffed the stack under his shirt, tucked the tube into a sling, and got out while his eyebrows were still his. The fight ended at the speed fights end when one side loses the reason it came. Hazan Signa led a withdrawal with 2 fingers and half a hand. His people fell back in a line that didn't present their backs until the last possible second, and then they were in the deeper dark beyond Temari's corridor. He didn't take his eyes off Naruto until the night swallowed him. He didn't look angry. He looked interested. Naruto got about 15 seconds to enjoy the part of the work where your lungs start believing in oxygen again. Then Hinata was at his side, eyes moving fast, hands inches from the schema sheets without touching them. Temari planted her fan and leaned over Naruto's shoulder to stare at the proof he'd stolen. It's not a blueprint, she said. No, Hinata said, soft, the kind of soft that comes from a stomach drop. It's resonance. Naruto's mouth went dry. Speak like a human. Temari tapped the top page. Symbols there weren't seals exactly. They were maps of stress and release, language written to teach sound how to behave. This trains metal to answer to promises. Not like your hand, like a mirror. If you sing a vow at the right pitch, this stuff sings back. End cuts. Courier already left, Hinata said, eyes far in a way that meant she was using her Byakugan backward. Not looking at the near but the near's echoes. When they raised the foundry, a relay node spooled up. The packets. She stopped, pinched the bridge of her nose, and switched to words that didn't belong to a lab. They sent the song ahead. To where? Naruto asked. Mountains, Hinata said. A relay there. If they finish tuning, they'll be able to cut any pledge that isn't theirs. Temari exhaled like she was deciding not to throw the fan at the moon. Perfect. Gorgeous. Hideous. She straightened. All right. We can chase. Can we? Naruto asked, Honestly, because part of being the kind of leader he wanted to be involved saying the quiet reality out loud. Or do we need to ask for help? Temari's mouth twisted, the thoughtful version of a smile. She reached into a chest by the foundry and pulled out a lacquered case. Inside were 3 wind tokens every child in Suna knows you don't touch. She picked one up, considered it, and then broke it with her thumb. The case smelled faintly of old cedar and embarrassment. You just burned a favor, Naruto said. I just spent one, Temari corrected. I keep them for when I'd rather win than be polite. She looked at him as if daring him to flinch. He didn't. My brother will hate the message. He'll understand it. We get an hour, maybe 2. A patrol will, accidentally, close a pass in the saw. The relay will have to route around. We'll use the time to hurt it. Our turn, then, Naruto said. He didn't pump a fist. He shook his hand out and found he had almost stopped shaking all on his own. They made camp not because they want Dita but because even sand shinobi bleed. The foundry cooled in ticks. The wind corridor sank back into the air like something embarrassed at having been useful. Naruto sat on the foundry roof where Temari did, boots dangling over a drop that didn't forgive people who got math wrong. He drank water that had learned to be warm and didn't care. Temari offered him a strip of dried dates she had secreted in an inner pocket like a treasure. He ate one and the sweetness swelled his throat with gratitude big enough to pass for humor. I hate being right about how ugly something is, Temari said. You were perfect, Naruto said, and meant the tactic and also the way she had said now without letting her voice carry weight it didn't need to. She snorted. Perfect is for statues. I like functioning. I like people who function, he said. It's rare. She glanced sidelong at him, something sly and not entirely gentle in the look. You like a lot of people, if the reports are true. I make room for them, he said. Not rising to the bait, not dodging it either. It helps when the world tries to make us smaller. Temari's fan was open just enough to draw a line in the air she could think against. You're very quotable for a person who throws himself into air. She stuck the end of the fan into a crack and drew one quick map on the soot with the tip of her boot. The map was the saw, only drawn the way wind understands it. We go here at first dark. Hinata, you'll tell us if the ground lies. Naruto, she held up a hand before he could promise anything grand. You'll do the small thing and the clever thing, in that order. He smiled. I can do small. You can try. Her mouth tilted. Banter with her had angles. It made him mind his footing in a way that felt like respect. Below, a groan. The foundry settled into its own ruin. From the far darkness of the dunes, a hawk's cry, the sand equivalent of a messenger's cough. Temari half turned, listening. Hour and a half, she said. I was optimistic. Naruto rubbed his palm. The feather there had become less like a brand and more like a penciled note. An hour and a half is a feast, he said. We'll spend it. Hazan stood 3 dunes away with his hand swaddled in clean cloth torn from a shirt that didn't look cheap. He existed in the crease between the wind and the sand the way a dune bug understands how to disappear by staying still. He watched them do the thing that pleased him about enemies. They planned with honesty. You could have taken his hand, someone said behind him, a choir woman with a voice like a sharpened spoon. I needed him to learn it hurt. Hazan said. Learning often requires fingers. Is that a joke? The woman asked, incredulous. I'm in pain, Hazan said mildly. It's never my best material. He nodded toward the foundry. Prepare the mountain. The song arrives early. We'll receive it nicely. He flexed what was left of his hand and watched the cloth spot. And give me a pen. You can't hold. I can hold a pen, Hazan said, and smiled at the notion like it had offered him an apology. I have 2 fewer fingers. I didn't lose patience. The woman didn't laugh. She didn't ask about the boy with the burning feather. She didn't say, Seraphim, because they had rules about names. She left the fold of shadow and went to work. Hazan looked up at the bright peppering of stars and wondered which of them didn't care about vows. Probably all of them. He envied that for half a breath that he would spend later. The desert turned her face toward night. Suna became a constellation of lamps. Men with wounds remembered wives and tea. Women with new bruises tried out the weight of the word safe like a coin. Hinata retied Naruto's forearm bandage and frowned when he hissed, but the frown was ritual, not scold. She touched the back of his hand once, brief, and then anchored her gaze on the map Tamari was drawing with sudden stubbornness. Left pass, Tamari said, notch, line, sweep, then the notch. Then the black ledge that will lie to you exactly once. We jump it. Hinata tracked the path with her eyes, committing the geometry to the quiet drawings behind her pupils. And if the relay hears us coming, then we pretend to have come for something else, Tamari said. If that fails, we accept that surprise as a short window and thrill as a stupid god. Naruto finished the last of tea. He dates and almost asked for another like a child with no dignity. He stopped when he saw Tamari had saved one without looking at it. She was that kind of person, greedy for her people and stingy for herself. He put the last one in her hand without theatricality. She took it and didn't say thank you because they were past the point where words kept score. Smaller first, he said. Smaller first, she echoed. They stood. The desert shifted its weight and watched them like a cat after napping. Naruto checked the canvas sack out of habit. He hadn't been smart enough to teach himself but had learned anyway. The hum inside was low and patient. It did not tug. It waited. He whispered to his hand, we're not promising the mountain. We're promising each other. Hinata glanced at him and, because she knew him, didn't tease. I'll keep you to it. Tamari yawned, unladylike and exactly right. Let's go make a relay have second thoughts. They left the foundry roof and the cooling smell of iron that had been too certain of itself. Sand took their footprints and edited them into something the world couldn't follow if it didn't already know the steps. Wind leaned in to listen. Far ahead, the saw lifted its teeth against the sky, little and close and then not, the way the desert jokes. Naruto felt too awake to be tired and too tired to make that a problem. He set his feet where the plan said and let the rest arrange itself after. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. Thunder above the catwalks. The mountains that mark Lightning Country don't just sit, they lean, like they're trying to listen to the wind talk about far-off places. Steel bridges tie the peaks together in lines so thin they look like brushstrokes against the sky. Below those lines, clouds wring themselves out on the rock and fall as rain that stings skin and memory. Naruto stood at the edge of the first catwalk with his hood down and let the weather introduce itself. The air tasted like a bitten battery. Don't lick anything, Tamari said, setting her fan against the rail and testing the flex. Some of these are grounded well. Some of them are held together with optimism and a sticker. Hinata's eyes went pale. Veins ghosted at her temples. I can see weld fatigue along the east line. And, something else, on the far span. She squinted. The air is mechanical. Quantized, the Kumo scout said, appearing at Naruto's shoal. With the silent grace of a person born to high wind. He was young enough to be shy with a leaf jonin and smart enough not to show it. He lifted 2 fingers in a respectful nod. Welcome to Kumo's least favorite tourist attraction. Our ops lead will meet you on the 3rd span. Ops lead? Naruto asked. Yugito ni, the scout said, not trying to hide his relief at not having to be in charge anymore. Try not to get set on fire. Not planning to, Naruto said, and tried not to grin too much. He had heard of Yugito. Calm, deadly, the kind of jonin who made discipline look like art. They moved single file. The catwalk wasn't narrow, but your body lies to you when you can see through the floor. Rain carried electricity like a friend with a bad idea. Naruto adjusted his footwork to a langua. GE of bolts and rivets and the slight sways that meant, we're fine, from the ones that meant, don't breathe right now. Hinata took rear guard, not because she was slow but because she liked to count people in and out of dangerous rooms. The 3rd span had a hitch in its voice where 2 pieces of steel had been married by a tired welder. Yugito stood at the center of that hitch. She wore Kumo black, K with pale trim that made her look like a line drawing waiting for the right hand to shade it. The rain loved her and slid off like it knew better than to cling. When she turned, her eyes were the act color of a night that has decided not to storm anymore because it would be rude. Leaf, she said, and then, not missing a beat, sand. Her gaze slid to Hinata and softened by a degree that was almost unmeasurable. Hyuga, Yugito, Hinata said, with the kind of small smile you use for competent people at the end of a long day. Tamari said, We brought you a problem and a solution and also Naruto. I see that, Yugito said. If there was humor there, it was small and dry. She jerked her chin toward the far peak. Iron Choir came through 2 nights ago. They left toys. Our sensors say song. E1 piggybacked a signature set off our Matabi containment logs and pushed it into a relay up there. She didn't look ashamed that Kumo had logs others could steal. She looked angry in a way that had manners. They mean to tune a node. Naruto glanced at the sky. Lightning crawled in threads more ordered than it should have been. Takaru's building a radio for promises, he said. We call it treason, Yugito said, very even. We'll use your word when I feel poetic. Fair, Naruto said. A single bell rang somewhere higher. Metal on metal, a polite alarm. Yugito's jaw ticked. They've started. They ran. Running a catwalk in a storm is like betting against a dealer you respect. You don't get to be cocky. You get to be precise. Tamari carved the air in thin corridors that hugged the railings tight, giving them lanes to move without fighting crosswinds. Hinata called weld conditions the way other people call weather, voice clipped and calm. Sound, sound, skip the next plate, sound, th. E-sound changed under Naruto's boots at exactly the points she named. He trusted her feet with his own. The relay sat on a floating deck hung between 2 peaks like a drum on a ribbon. It had been Kumo, once. Now it wore a carapace of plates so smooth they might not have been metal at all. The plates formed shapes that made the eyes want to blink and start over. Naruto felt the hair behind his ears lift. Don't look dead on, Yugito murmured. Let your peripheral do the work. People moved on the deck. Some were Kumo engineers, hands bound behind them with cable ties, faces set in expressions T. Had refused to let fear shop for an audience. Others were choir, veiled, economical, irritatingly confident. And then there was the figure at center. He was not built to be looked at straight. The rain slid around him instead of over him, parting into neat lines as if he carried a geometry the weather respected more than it respected gravity. Wings unfolded from his back, not feathers but planes th. At changed size in little ticks like a bad clock correcting itself. His head tilted with exact increments. His face was an argument. The left half red as a mask polished to mirror when the light felt like it. The right was something that had tried to be a face and had gotten distracted by math. He lifted one finger. The deck stopped humming. Even the rain hesitated. Azoth, Yugito said. She didn't spit the word. She filed it. Azoth did not look at them. He looked at the space around them, found the seams, and pressed. Naruto felt the air fall into squares. His next step landed on one square, and refused to cross into the next until his weight satisfied a condition he didn't recognize. The wind didn't blow, it ticked. Hinata's breath fogged in a grid. Tamari swore once, very prettily, under her breath. What is that? Naruto asked, not because he wanted a lecture but because sometimes a word is a lever. Quantization, Yugito said. He's turning the field into a stair only he knows the rhythm of. Rude, Tamari said. Her fan's edges trembled. The air ignored the invitation to flow and counted itself instead. Azoth's head turned by a precise angle until his glance kissed them. When he spoke, it wasn't a voice. It was brackets closing around a sentence. Non-compliant choir, he said. The word choir made Hazan's name echo in Naruto's head, different music, same precision. Parameter. Remove interference. He moved. He didn't run. He redefined the space between himself and Naruto so that the distance obeyed him. One beat he was where he had been, the next beat, without crossing the forbidden squares. He was in front of Naruto, 2 steps inside comfortable and 1 step inside regret. A hand cut down, fingers together, and the air between them tried to behave. Naruto's body refused. He didn't fight for height. He fought for angle. He turned his hip, let the chop graze shoulder and not throat, took the pain like a small tax you pay to keep a business open, and slid left. Onto a plate that admitted him because Hinata's voice said, now. He snapped a palm up, not to strike but to press the edge of his hand against Azoth's wrist and turn it a fraction. The wing nearest him repaneled with a series of quiet clicks. Azoth didn't seem surprised. He seemed interested in the lack of surprise. Temari's wind found a wobble in the grid and made it wider. Yugito moved. Blue. Fire ran the seam of her hand and didn't drip. When it touched the quantized air, the air objected, and then remembered it had once been a storm, not a piece of paper. Sparks crawled. Blue on gold, gold on blue, without ownership. Naruto felt his palm heat. He wanted to make a dome. He wanted to write one sentence across the sky and have it hold. He didn't. The last 2 days had taught him something. He'd known and ignored. Smaller is stronger. He touched 2 fingers to the rail. The steel hummed like a stretched string. "We keep the line," he said, not loud, not grand, to Hinata, to Temari, to Yugito. To anyone who had the stomach to hear it. "No one breaks." The heat in his palm shot up his arm and spread across his collarbones like a shawl a grandmother would knit if she liked thunder. P.R. Escher gathered between his chest and the rail and then leapt, not as a wall but as a thread. It left him and found Hinata because Hinata had already reached for it. It kissed the inside of her wrist. And burned a thin gold line. She didn't flinch. It ran from her to Temari. Temari hissed a nice swear and smirked like the pain amused her. From Temari to Yugito. Yugito's eyes narrowed and something in her posture admitted, useful. And from Yugito back to Naruto, closing a circuit. The world didn't get easy. The world got real. Naruto felt the footfalls of the people he'd tethered to himself. He way you feel when your own heartbeat hiccups. He didn't hold them like a leash. He held them the way hands hold when both want to cross the street at the same time without talking about it. Azoth paused. His head without being a head tipped the smallest possible increment. "Illegal routing," he said. The rain ticked harder. "File a complaint," Temari said crisply, and drove wind through a narrow slot in high-wing geometry. One plane snapped closed. Azoth compensated without wasted motion. The way a dancer who has rehearsed a misstep is better than a dancer who's only rehearsed the flawless version. The choir guards rushed the tie-downs with a timing that would have been admirable if it didn't make Naruto want to trip them out of spite. Hinata moved through them like modest weather, efficient, unavoidable, kind. The Kumo engineers ducked and did not scream. Naruto saw one of them reach for a fellow's elbow without looking and tug him out of a blade arc as if they'd practiced it in a hallway with a bowl of tea. "Bridge weld failing," Hinata called. "On your 3. Her eyes tracked stress like they'd been designed to argue with it. "Copy," Naruto said, and stepped where she said, N.D. The plate that would have betrayed his ankle a beat later got to betray nobody at all. The tether sang when he moved too far from Temari. It pinched his chest like a stitch. He changed course to relieve it. Temari felt him yield and cut her own wind angle to ease the tension. Yugito's blue flame licked the line, not burning but acknowledging. The 3 of them found a rhythm in 2 breaths that would have taken a week to teach on paper. Azoth re-tabbed reality. The grid tightened. His hand cut down again and the rain obeyed him, slicing into straight lines that made Hinata's eyelashes bead the wrong way. He moved to sweep the rail, to erase the line that held the vow thread tight. Naruto did something he didn't plan and therefore couldn't take credit for. He stepped away. It wasn't tactical in the usual way. In the usual way, stepping away when an enemy is taking your space is stupid. But the thread had taught him something about who was at the center. He wasn't. They were. He took high MSELF off the spot he loved, front and mid, and put Temari there. She filled it like the weather fills a valley. Her fan snapped in an arc that made Azoth's hand meet a curve instead of a line. Yugito slid under that arc. Blue fire riding a new edge into the moment. Hinata pivoted behind both, palm open, touching Azoth's elbow through the quantized air like that air owed her money. For half a breath, the executor's balance belonged to them. He corrected. Of course he corrected. He didn't have pride to trip over. He had parameters. He shifted weight in a way that should not have allowed him to still be upright and was still upright. His wing made a sound like new paper being folded 9 times and never crumpling. He lifted a hand to adjust the rein again. A chain whistled like a bad joke and wrapped his wrist with a clang that no grid accepted. "What did I miss?" Karen demanded, skidding onto the deck with her hair wild from wind and a temper that hadn't cooled since the desert. She braced both feet, set her shoulders like a woman preparing to move a house, and yanked. Seals glowed up her forearms like someone had drawn constellations and then lit them in an order only she knew. "You throw a party, you don't invite me. And you let the ugly one redecorate the sky. Rude, Karen," Naruto said, completely, stupidly delighted. She rolled her eyes. Please don't sound that happy. It's embarrassing. She flicked a paper seal onto the rail. The seal crawled like it had legs and stuck. By the way, Uzumaki, the feedback in your little friendship string is appalling. Who taught you to wire a choir, a gull? Nobody, Naruto said. We're improvising. Great, Karen said. You're going to kill yourselves with it. Hyuga, when it tries to sing too hard through him, pinch here. She lit a finger toward Naruto's shoulder without looking, and Hinata's hand was there a fraction ahead, tapping a knot that made the line ease a hair. Naruto's head cleared like he'd been underwater and someone had moved the shore closer. Azoth looked at the chain on his wrist and then at Karen as if she were a paragraph he had not accounted for. Unauthorized constraint. Authorized by me, Karen said, flashing teeth. She hauled on the chain, not to drag him but to make the math of his stance disagree with itself. His heel came up. He put it down again because physics still had opinions he wasn't allowed to ignore. Also, who installed your voice? It's making me hate you in too clean a way. Temari's fan snapped open and closed. Focus, please. Focused, Karen said, and flung a second chain. It snagged the plate seam at Azoth's wing base. She slapped another seal onto the deck and the chain learned how to want that seal more than it wanted the wing. Azoth's arm tracked both wants like an abacus. Matabi's pattern, Yugito said, low, to Naruto, eyes still on Azoth. Do you smell it? He did, though smell was the wrong sense. It was a signature under the storm. Blue, precise, disciplined, not the beast. But someone had written her moves in copper wire and fed them to an algorithm. Naruto's mouth went bitter. He's using her steps to teach the grid how to dance. Then we give it bad rhythm, Yugito said. She lifted her hand. Blue fire crawled out, not loud, disciplined. It hit the quantized air like a jazz drummer interrupting a metronome. Hinata's voice touched Naruto's ear as intimately as a palm. Weak weld. 3 o'clock. If you move it, this section will. He didn't wait. Covenant of breakage, he said, and the line tightened so hard Karen hissed, warn me next time, through her teeth. He didn't speak to the sky. He spoke to the rail and the weld and the span and the people on it. This bridge falls only when we're done with it. The stress pattern in the L glowed in Hinata's sight like a city grid. Naruto's promise threw a net across that grid and tied the lights together. The vow did not make the bridge stronger. It gave it a schedule. Azoth cocked his head. Impossible constraint, he said, and cut his hand toward the weld. Later, Naruto told the metal, and the metal agreed, not because it loved him but because it loved a kept appointment. Ari breathed one syllable of laughter that sounded like sand struck with a wet stick. You ridiculous man, she said, proud and terrified, and maybe a little angry for liking both at once. Azoth let go of the chain. He made a tiny change in the grid that froze the rain mid-arc. The droplets hung, a curtain of beads strung on invisible threads. He reached toward the tether, fingers close and precise, intending to adjust the parameter at source. Yugito stepped into his reach. She didn't attack. She stood and let blue fire lick up her forearms in parallel lines that matched the grid and then weren't the grid anymore. We don't belong to you, she said, and there was no heat in it. The executor paused. She met where his eyes would be and Naruto watched something fascinating happen. A machine earned there were wrong answers to some questions. Noncompliant node, Azoth murmured. Yugito's mouth tilted, the ghost of a smile that had never asked permission. Proud of it, Naruto moved when she said that. Not forward, under. He vaulted the rail, feet catching a rung he shouldn't have been able to see, and dropped onto the maintenance line hanging a man's height below the deck. The world tilted. His stomach objected. He complimented it on its courage and kept going. The tether yanked his chest toward the others until Hinata tapped the spot Karen had pointed out and the line eased. The fort felt like a hand at the back of his neck, borrowing skin to be brave in. From the underside, the relay looked like it believed in prayer. Cables pinned in tidy sets, plates numbered in a logic that someone had loved. Naruto found the weld Hinata had named by the color it wanted to be. He set his palm on it. Tell me, he said to Steel, a boy asking a stray dog what name it had before anyone yelled at it. The feather underneath his skin warmed. Pressure gathered in his wrist and bled into the weld. He didn't ask it to be heroic. He asked it to be punctual, later. Above him, Karen shouted, "Hurry, Naruto. This grid is flirting with me and I hate it." Her chain clanged. Azoth shifted, almost curious. Temari's fan sang. Yugito's fire answered itself. Naruto breathed, felt the weld's answer, and let go. He hauled himself up hand over hand and cleared the rail in a smooth roll that would have impressed him if he hadn't been busy being terrified. Azoth reached for him again. Naruto didn't oblige. He stepped sideways into wind that Temari curled under his foot like a purring cat. He came up next to Yugito and their shoulders touched and the blue fire along her arm tickled his skin and didn't burn. "If we live," she said. Very quiet, "we have tea." "Deal," he said, without the part of his brain that jokes, because there are some sentences you don't decorate. Azoth recalculated. He would keep recalculating until someone took away his pen. Naruto didn't intend to be that pen. He intended to be the paragraph he couldn't edit. The tether tightened as Hinata darted across the grid, to yank a Kumo engineer out from under a collapsing pylon. Naruto felt the yank and leaned into it. The line took his balance and made a joke into a stance. He laughed once, helpless and happy. "Stop enjoying yourself," Temari said between her teeth. "Can't," he said. "It's working." Azoth decided to end the experiment. He drew both hands up, planes of wing slotting into each other until they met a shape that made the stomach make opinions. The grid flexed. The rain reversed. For an instant the entire deck became a mirror that showed only one face. Down. Yugito snapped, and blue fire sheeted across them like a cloak. Not to block the mirror but to give it a better reflection. Theirs, plural. The blow met the sheet and found resistance that wasn't force so much as posture. "We remain." The weld Naruto had promised to break later coughed. "Now," Hinata said, a calm blade. "Now," Temari echoed, and cut a wind line that ran the length of the deck's spine. "Now," Karen said, and tore her chain toward the seal at the rail's foot like she was ringing a bell she disliked. "Now," Naruto said to the bridge, because he had promised, and the bridge kept the appointment like a polite killer. It didn't explode. It let go. The center span sagged into a graceful bow and then failed all at once. The deck folded in the middle like a throat swallowing. Everything on it went down. Naruto grabbed Yugito's forearm and Hinata's sleeve grabbed his and Temari's fingers caught the back of his hood in a way that would have been comical if the drop hadn't been real. The tether screamed up his chest. And then found a new shape to be and became a plane. They surfed it. There was no time for elegance. Naruto threw his hand out and the pressure field that wanted to be a dome remembered it could be a sheet. It flexed under four bodies and the handful of engineers who had failed with them and Karen, who yelled something unprintable but did not let go of the chain in her hand because she had decided it was important. The sheet tilted. Air ran under it like a river. The falling deck thundered past them into the cloud throat beneath, breaking itself with an honest noise. Azoth fell with it. He fell beautifully, like someone showing you how falling should be done. At the last second, something in his wings re-tabbed the grid. He hit the thunder seam and did not vanish. The lightning ate half his face and he did not scream because he did not know what that was for. He climbed out of the well with sparks walking his shoulder like pets. The rain avoided his wound out of respect for a thing it did not understand. Naruto landed the sheet hard on a maintenance platform slung under the next span. The platform groaned like old men getting off tatami. The sheet broke into backward steam. Everyone who had been on it lay exactly where they landed for 2 breaths and then remembered they were alive and began to make new mistakes. Karen rolled to her knees and slapped a seal on Naruto's shoulder, not gentle. "Stop being brave," she snapped. "I haven't stitched the echo lines into an acceptable rhythm." Later, Naruto said, dazed and pleased with the word. "You're learning," she said, and because she was Karen, she followed it with, "I hate it when my friends learn things that make me feel feelings." Temari was already up, fan reversed to function as a lever to pry a bent strut off a Kumo engineer's ankle. Yugito lifted the strut with her bare hands and put it down like it weighed patience. She and Temari shared a glance that wasn't flirtation and wasn't not. Respect is a longer story. Hinata knelt by the rail, eyes pale again. "The relay is dead," she said, voice quiet with the kind of satisfaction that has nothing to do with gloating and everything to do with not being too late. The tune didn't take. It will root, Yugito said, still watching the hole where Azoth had fallen. It always does. We'll be there, Naruto said. It came out like a promise because it was one. The feather in his palm warmed in agreement and then cooled when Hinata tapped that little knot, coaching the power to cool with him. Azoth stood on the far span. His face, half of it, had lost the aya of skin and replaced it with something that looked like glass baptized in lightning. The other half remained as it had been, an almost face, tidy and precise. He stared at Naruto with no expression because he didn't have one to use. That didn't mean there was no emotion. It meant there was no word yet. You changed the center, Azoth said. Parameter. Center equals group. Naruto thought about saying something clever. He didn't. Yes, he said. Azoth's head clicked to a new angle. Record, he said, which might have been to himself or the sky. Result. Error persists. Good, Tamari murmured. Azoth stepped back until the rain took him away. Not vanished. Removed. The platform sighed around them. Kumo engineers who had not fallen off something highly specific hugged each other without making a speech about it. The scout who had met them at the first bridge tried not to stare at Yugito's half-burnt sleeve and then stared at it anyway when she lifted her arm and shook it out like nothing had happened. She looked at Naruto. She said. You owe me. I owe you, he said. He couldn't keep his mouth from unlatching into the ghost of a grin. You were perfect. She tilted her head. No, we were. Gross, Karen said, standing with a hand on her back like a grandmother who's been moved out of her chair too fast. I'm filing this under moments that will embarrass me later if anyone describes them out loud. Hinata stood and touched Naruto's wrist. Once, calibration, comfort, and spoken report. His pulse had smoothed, the line's echo wouldn't scar if he let it rest. He met her eyes. Something inside him, stubborn and wild, folded quiet. He didn't try to name it. Tamari flicked water off the end of her fan with a practiced snap and looked toward the ridge where the saw climbed higher. We made trouble, she said. I'm bored of this bridge. Let's go make it under a nicer piece of steel. They gathered what could be gathered. Kumo patrols climbed toward them on ropes, eyes sharp and mouths set. Commands passed without theater. Yugito delegated with gentle violence. You, splints. You, calls. You, don't touch that or I'll make you wish you hadn't. She turned back to Naruto, hen to the panel of plates that had tried very hard to not be metal, then to Naruto again. They'll route the tune, she said. To the ocean, the node in the southeast grid. She didn't say, Uzushio. She didn't need to. The word lived in all their throats. Naruto nodded. We were going back anyway. I know, she said, like he'd said, breakfast, and she'd been hungry too. I'm coming. You have a village, Hinata said, not a rebuke. A fact. Yugito said, and if I stay I'll end up guarding a door while someone else drowns in a room I could have unflooded. Kumo has people. You need a person. She lifted one eyebrow a fraction. Unless you only invited me for tea. Both can be true, Naruto said. Good answer, Yugito said. Karen squinted at the sky as if it were a person she recognized from an old debt. You feel that? She asked no one and everyone. The relay may be dead, but something else is awake. The big one turned on a light. Tamari nodded, eyes narrow, wind tasting her cheekbones. We cut a hand, she said. The mind is still writing orders. They moved off the platform in carefully chosen steps. Kumo had rigged a shuttle line for casualties. Hinata supervised the transfers with that quiet authority that never complains about being noticed. Naruto stood at the edge of the span and looked into the thunder well. He didn't like the familiarity of it. He didn't dislike it either. There's a flavor to surviving something that wants to become a habit if you let it. He had no intention of letting it. Hey, Tamari said, coming up beside him. She bumped his shoulder with hers, light. You chose to step away back there. Her tone made it a compliment and a warning. Do more of that. I like being the center, he said, honest. I know, she said. But you're prettier as a constellation. He made a face. Gross, he said, purposely echoing Karen to make Tamari huff a laugh through her nose. Yugito joined them, arms folded, blue flame snuffed like a candle that still warmed a room. Azoth, she said, testing the syllables. He isn't alive the way we are. He's learning, Hinata said, as if that were worse. It usually is, at first, Naruto said. He looked east, toward the ocean that had become the story's next sentence. Let's give him good lessons. They reached the staging ledge where Kumo kept coil ropes and tea and a neat box of bandages that looked like it had opinions about the people who used too many. The scout from earlier thrust a steaming cup into Yugito's hands, then, after only a second of panic, into Naruto's. Naruto took it like a ceremony he wanted to be worthy of. To roots that didn't take, Yugito said. To breaking on time, Naruto said. To small first, Temari added. Hinata didn't lift a cup. She touched the rail and said, soft, to nobody and everyone. Thank you, to a bridge that had done what it promised and gotten to die with dignity instead of in panic. Karen wiped rain off her eyelids with the heel of her palm. All right, she announced. We're going back to the dumb drowned city, aren't we? We are, Naruto said. Good, she said. I have chains that want to know what pressure does to old sins. Temari looked at him over her cup. You said we were going anyway. Why? Naruto ran his thumb over the feather under his skin, feeling the line between comfort and burn. Because I don't want a leash, he said. If the pact is a leash, we cut it. If it's a bridge, we build it right. Yugito's gaze sharpened. And if it's both, then we teach it to be a door, Naruto said. He felt ridiculous and right at the same time. He leaned into right, and we stand in it. The wind shifted. The storm let them go. Kumo patrols melted back into their reign, carrying people whose lives had been interrupted by someone else's idea of order and now returned to the slower cruelty of weather. Naruto's team tightened packs, retied laces, counted each other again. Do we sleep? Temari asked. We walk, Yugito said. There's a window before the reroute. We take it. Hinata squeezed Naruto's wrist once. Calibration, ritual, trust, and let go. We'll need a boat, she said. And someone who can pray ironically. Two birds, Karen said. I'll do both. They laughed because the alternative was too heavy and because laughing with people you respect is the fastest way to make a complicated thing survivable. They set out along the catwalk. The mountain's breath cold and kind. Naruto fell into step between Hinata and Yugito. Temari walked a little ahead because someone should. Karen walked a little behind because someone else should. And because she wanted an excuse to make jokes about their backs. Halfway to the ridge, the rain stuttered into mist. Naruto looked back without thinking. On the far span, where Azoth had stood, a small slick remained. Not blood, not oil, lightning's quiet spit. It smoked and then didn't. He didn't wave at it. He didn't promise it anything. He promised himself he would remember it without giving it more story than it deserved. Naruto, Yugito said, as if she'd heard the promise. Yeah, if you tell me the tea is good in Uzushio, I'm going to push you off this bridge. It's terrible, he said. It tastes like someone boiled guilt. Wonderful, she said. I'll bring my own leaves. Temari didn't look back. I'm not carrying anyone, she said lightly. If you fall gracefully. Hinata said. He doesn't do anything else. Karen snorted. He does messy. He does messy very, very well. Thank you, Naruto said, meaning it. They reached the ridge and dropped down to a shale chute that would have been interesting if they had time to play. They didn't. They moved. Kumo seeded them a path that existed for people who had reasons to get to the sea fast and secrets tea. Had liked paths that didn't show up on nice maps. Clouds peeled away in strips. Somewhere below that horizon, Uzushio's ribs waited to be read again. Naruto touched his palm once and felt the feather answer, neither demand nor invitation. He thought of breakage timed and shared. He thought of the line that had held because they'd pulled together. He thought of Azoth's voice saying center equals groupa. ND felt whatever version of pride lives in your lungs turn into something steadier. Smaller first, he said, like a prayer he'd earned the right to say. Smaller first, they echoed, like a choir that had written its own music. They went down to meet the drowned city, and the city listened for their footfalls with the patience of old stone. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. The choir below. The boatman sold them silence and a wet grin. His oars knew the channels like old men know gossip, every stroke a rumor that turned true. Uzushio's ribs lifted out of the black water as they slid into the drowned city from the lee side, where ferns grew on stone like green handwriting. The sea breathed in the caves. Naruto tasted salt and old iron and something else, the same almost sound that had hummed in his palm for days now. He flexed his hand against the sack where the cylinder lay. It hummed back, not louder, closer. Another great vacation spot, Karen muttered, peering into the throat of the nearest tunnel like it had stiffed her on a bill. Tamari smirked into her scarf. Send a postcard, she said. Wish you were here. Yugito tightened and retied the strap on her glove. Eyes open, she said. We go quiet. We come back loud. Hinata brushed Naruto's wrist with 2 fingertips, the quick calibration that had become a habit between them. Smaller first, she said, and the words softened his shoulders the way hot tea does. They left the boat at a low lip where barnacles wrote their own language and moved into the dark on cat feet. The caves remembered them. The air pressure changed the way a room does when someone you love steps in. Naruto kept his breath slow on purpose and named a promise under it. I will not wake anything that doesn't want to wake. The feather in his palm warmed a degree that was more feeling than heat. The first door they met wasn't a door. It was a seam of stone that shouldn't have been there, a slice of wall where the water that seeped down couldn't decide whether to beat or run. Not a trap, a test. Tamari rubbed a thumb along the stone's edge. What's the sentence? She asked, as if the door were a reluctant official. Naruto stepped close and felt the hum in the cylinder flicker in sympathy, as if the thing in the sack were trying not to be rude. He set his palm to the seam. Pressure gathered and asked him a question he'd heard 1,000 ways. Since he was a kid with too much certainty and a headband too tight, will you never fail? He smiled because the answer a 20-year-old Naruto would have given was proud and pretty and wrong. No, he said softly. To the stone and the hum and the part of himself that still liked big declarations because they made the fear sit down. I will fail, and I will return. He tasted the words. They tasted like steel cooled under rain. The seam dissolved the way guilt does when you tell the truth about it. The door slid back just enough. Air moved through, sea cold and clean. Tamari tapped the stone with her fan tip, approving. Good door, she said. Finally one with taste. They went inward. Uzushio's undergut hadn't drowned so much as changed hobbies. Halls that had once held libraries now held quiet pressure. Courtyards became cisterns that whales could have visited if they'd had an afternoon free. Naruto didn't try to drink it all with his eyes. The city would be there long after they failed or didn't. It could keep its secrets a while longer. He watched instead the places where the echo changed, the bits of tunnel that swallowed sound and the bits that threw it back too quickly, hush pockets and resonance pits. Someone's careful work laid down like rules and then forgotten by everyone except the people who came down here to write new rules on top of the old. Hinata touched a section of wall that seemed perfectly fine. This isn't load, she murmured. It's promise strain, like glass with a flaw. Naruto tracked the hairline shimmer his eyes couldn't quite see until she showed him where to look sideways. He breathed out a laugh. You can read lies in stone now. I can read stress where somebody asked too much, Hinata said, and the smile that escaped her had a little Apollo. GY in it for being pleased about that in a place like this. Try to ask less, or closer. Noted, he said, and meant it. They came to a culvert that had been a street and now was an underground river with a bad attitude. The water shot from a crack and carved a deep chute for itself before calming again. Naruto put his fingers in the spray and felt the force. We can cross, he said, mostly to give the group a map to step onto. But nobody gets clever alone. Karen rolled her shoulders. I wasn't going to, she said. My chains want to flirt with this current, but I told them we're on a work trip. Tamari knelt and pressed a wind coin against the lip of the chute. It hummed and the air folded, pulling the spray's edge back half a foot. 15 count windows, she said. Hyuga. Hinata pointed where the turbulence stuttered. There, then over. She looked at Naruto and lifted her brows. Small promise. He nodded. This, he said, cupping air with careful fingers, doesn't fall until you pass. He set a shallow pressure shelf over the worst of the boiling throat. Not a bridge, not a dare, just a hand offered. Each person stepped when Hinata tapped their shoulder, and each T. Ime the shelf took weight and then vanished like a breath you let go. They were 2 people from finishing when a voice that wasn't water or wind came out of the dark like a spoon tapping a glass. That is very neat, Hazan said mildly from the far lip. I have never seen anyone make compacts with a river before. Does it say thank you when you're done? Karen's hand went to her seals like a reflex. Naruto's went to his side where the shallow feathersteel cut still itched when he thought about making promises too big to hold. Hazan stepped out of shadow without bodyguards this time, light hood. Left glove wrapped where his missing fingers should have been like an honest necklace. He wasn't posturing, he was planning. Hazan, Naruto said. He let the name be friendly without inviting anything. I was hoping we wouldn't see you. I believe you, Hazan said, amused. His gaze slid, civil, exact, to Karen. Hello, Uzumaki. Don't, Karen said. She stepped up onto Naruto's pressure shelf like she'd been born to test other people's work and turned sideways so her weight made a line instead of a point. If you call me that like it's a category, I'll take your other fingers out of spite. Noted, Hazan said. Karen, then, you and I need to speak. We're spoken out, she said. About the chain logic you threw into my man's spine in the desert, Hazan went on, tone infuriatingly conversational. It taught me about your intent structure. Karen's mouth curved. And you came without 10 of your clever friends to see if I'd teach you for free. Brave. Hazan's eyes twitched once, not toward his wrapped hand. He didn't mind her seeing, then, or he minded in a way that he converted into advantage. You learn to anchor. Hurt what you mean to hurt, to a conditioned reflex in under a breath, he said. Tone a professional would use for another professional. You understand why my choir cares. Because your math can't account for a person deciding not to be a knife that day, Karen said. She took one more step. Into his space. You want my chains. You can't have them. Hinata's voice came low, even. Naruto, she said. Left wall. A strain. He didn't look. He shifted his weight in. D brought his palm up like he wasn't thinking about it. Later, he told the stone, and the wall agreed, knowing it had a turn to take and not taking it yet. Hazan's gaze cut to Naruto's hand, then back to Karen. We could hurt each other, he said, or we could shake once and leave. There's a relay below you that doesn't care about either choice. I vote, Tamari said dryly, for the version we. I don't flip a coin for who I get to throw into the river. Hyuga, strains easing, Hinata said. She touched Naruto's wrist. 2 fingers, precise, tightening their tether just enough. We can move. Hazan took a step backward. Not retreating, re-sketching the ground. Next time, he said to Karen, same tone you say we'll continue this when the office is open, I'll bring a pen. Bring a pillow, she said. You'll need something to cry into. Tamari didn't look at Hazan when she fanned a narrow, almost polite corridor of moving air along the lip. We're done, she said. Walk away. Hazan walked. Not far. Just enough that when the engagement came again, it would be his, not the cave's. He lifted his wrapped hand a fraction, a decent salute, and let the dark take him. You going to brand him later? Tamari asked Karen under her breath. Oh, absolutely, Karen said. But not now, not where the walls listen. It'll take when it matters. They crossed. The crypts flattened into a long LL that had once been ceremonial and still knew the shape. Columns shaped like stylized waves climbed to a ceiling that had learned to carry the weight of a sea. Naruto felt the low, patient hum in his bones more than his ears. When he pressed his palm to a column he expected stone, he felt warmth, like a body had leaned there recently. The mural waited on the far wall, half underwater lines in NLAID mineral that still caught light where no light should have reached. It didn't look like a dragon in the way a hero's banner would draw one. It looked like a sky of feathers, each the size of a hand. Each etched with tiny sigils that weren't seals so much as names. The feathers weren't centered. They moved through the image like a school of fish that respected each other. There was no head. Here was a space, left for the viewer to stand in. Naruto stepped into the blank not because he thought he was important but because the mural asked someone to and nobody else was reckless enough to go first. He expected power to rush him the way weather does when it passes through a narrow rock gate. Nothing rushed. Something spread. Heat moved through the floor under his feet and up his calves, not burning, not claiming. It was an invitation. It smelled like sun on water and the kind of legal paper you sign because you actually trust the person on the other side. In the stone feathering around him he heard songs. Not words. Breath patterns. Laughs caught somewhere between a sob and a relief. Promises the size of a morning chore list. I'll take the early watch. I'll bring the water. I'll see. Ari. The air wrote them along his skin and didn't insist. He touched his palm to the closest feather. The ghost feather under his skin flared, answering, not obeying. He wanted to kneel and put his head to the stone. He didn't. He looked back first. Hinata was watching him and the mural both, eyes pale with Byakugan and dark with everything else. The lines of strain she could read ran soft here, as if the room that had hoarded oaths for a century had kept them stretched loose and breathable. Tamari stood a pace off with arms folded, the look she wore for things she chose to respect. Karen stared like a scientist discovering gossip. Yugito's jaw set and softened in the same breath. You see it? Naruto asked, quiet because the wall deserved the courtesy. Hinata nodded. It's not a god, she said. It's a choir. Tamari said, amused because the name hurt the right people. Yugito let her hand drift, blue fire not even a candle's worth. It reflected in the mineral lamina like eyes opening. It's distributed, she said. No center to cut. Naruto breathed out a laugh that shook a little. Relief and fear do that when they come together and agree to be friends. Then we don't have to stop being people to use it, he said. We have to be more of them. Karen snorted. And you thought you were dangerous before. Something moved at the edge of the hearing. Not feet. Not steel. A pressure that made the walls think about how load worked. Temari's fan dipped before her body tensed because her senses are polite to the wind. Hinata's fingers slid to Naruto's wrist in the same instant. Karen's chain seals rolled into her palm. Yugito's chin lifted, blue at her knuckles the exact color of a disciplined flame. Azoth stepped out of an archway that had been shadow and decided to be shape. Water beaded on the floor the way it does when someone cold walks into a warm room. The right half of his face glittered with lightning-baptized glass, the left half remained an uncommitted geometry. He did not look at the mural, which told Naruto more than if he'd worshipped it. Violation of parameter, Azoth said. His voice had grown a shade more human. It sounded like a bored clerk imitating a priest. Node must not diffuse. We're not asking it to, Naruto said, steady. We are it. That makes you a guest. Azoth ignored him because he could. He pointed in the water in the far eyed chamber stepped aside to show that it had been hiding people. 6 civilians, bare feet on wet stone, wrists bound behind them with cables wrapped in sigils that made the eyes slip. They didn't stir, even because people who are used to caves don't waste breath on noise that won't help. Little discs glittered at each ankle, hushed toys with extra rings etched in, like someone had written trigonometry over a hymn. That's new, Karen said. Every word a knife for someone's throat. Vow bombs. Azoth inclined his head a degree. If you break a promise while within range, he said, the agreement collapses. Collapse triggers detonation. The parameters are wide. Most of you will fail in under 2 minutes by default. Tamari swore with elegance. Define. Break, she said. Your heart rate reveals non-compliance, Azoth said. How dare you, Karen said, too softly. People sweat. That's not lying. That's surviving. Yugito's forearm flexed. Blue fire crawled up in thin veins that found her pulse and paced it. She looked at Naruto without turning her head. We could cut them free, she said. Hinata's Byakugan mapped the sigils. The chains are a lie, she murmured. They're for our eyes. The triggers are shared. If one detonates, the others go. And the threshold tightens if anyone says, I promise. Naruto set his hand on the mural because he was a simple creature when he was honest. He felt the hum under his palm answer with the same patience that had greeted him when he stepped into the blank space. He looked at the hostages. He didn't look back at Azoth. He spoke to his people like he did under rain and on catwalk steel. We share it, he said. All of it. Tamari didn't blink. Detail. Covenant of many, Naruto said. He didn't shout. Shouting would have made the room defensive. He lifted his hand. Threads of heat gathering across his knuckles like fine gold hair in sunlight. If one keeps it, I'll keep it. He made it small. He made it exact. He didn't make a grand speech about saving anyone. He promised something punishingly plain. I will keep breathing. The thread struck Hinata first, because she was ready, and ran from her into Temari and from Temari into Yugito and from Yugito into Karen. And then, crossing the wet floor like a thin path of warmth laid down for bare feet, the threads touched the ankles of the 6 civilians. The hush rings twitched like they'd been insulted. Azoth stepped forward to cut. Hinata cut ahead of him, palm flat, tapping Naruto's shoulder knot in the exact place Karen had taught her, easing the pull so the line didn't saw. Temari drew wind over the threads, not to hide them but to carry their rhythm past the sigils, ears. Yugito matched her breathing to Naruto's on purpose, a count she could run in her sleep. Karen slapped 4 seals on the floor with one hand and muttered something obscene and medical about feedback. The hush rings brightened and then dulled, confused. Naruto walked. He didn't make himself the center. He walked past it, slow, careful footfalls. His breath loud in his ears not because he was afraid but because that's what human breath sounds like when you put your head on a lover's chest and decide to live. He took each breath like he owed it to the next person in the chain. He whispered to the bombs like they were stubborn donkeys, small promises are still promises. Greedy things. The first civilly, an old woman with river hands, looked at him as if he were the idiot savior archetype she'd hoped to never see, and then as her ankle ring cooled she laughed once, very soft. She matched his breathing on purpose. All right, she said. We won't hurry. Azoth extended 2 fingers to slice the line. Karen jerked her chain and those 2 fingers hit a seal she'd laid there just to annoy geometry. Zoth's hand changed angle the width of a human hair. Temari's wind slid into that hair and wedged. The executor's grip on the world's edges loosened by a degree a fisherman would call important. Other promises? Temari asked, voice slow like they were disguised as people not doing combat math in a room with bombs. Give me 2. I'll finish the step I start, Naruto said. The line warmed in grateful agreement. I won't speak the word never. Good boy, Karen said under her breath, which was how she said I love you without that particular humiliation. They took the 2nd civilian. The 3rd, Hinata named the tightness points the way a midwife names bones and patience. Naruto pulled his own want for grandness in and kept feeding the thread with little oaths that you don't pin on banners. I'll drink when offered. I'll listen when told to stop. I'll return the canteen. Azoth stood in the center of it and learned. The learning lewd like nothing. It felt like a machine turning its head toward a new axis. He reached for Yugito's hand once. She let him touch the air around it and refused to give him her skin. No, she said, without heat. That constitutes a failed connection, Azoth said. It constitutes a boundary, Yugito said. You don't get to own those. When the last hush ring cooled, the room exhaled as if it had lungs. The civilians. Ropes fell apart like cheap twine. Illusions, the room's bad joke. Naruto touched the old woman's shoulder and nodded to the exit they'd cut clear behind with water and patience. Temari directed them with 2 fingers and her fan held low, making a corridor that wasn't there until you walked it. Hinata took one girl's hand and didn't let go until she knew someone else would. Karen spat on a hush disc as it died. Sleep, she told it. You weren't good at your job. Azoth watched. His head tipped, a new angle, slower than before. You changed the promise, he said, very quiet. You made it collective. Naruto watched him. Join or don't, he said. But don't mistake hum for hunger. Your metaphor does not parse, Azoth said. It will, Naruto said. Azoth looked beyond him, to the mural, to the blank space the wall had left for anyone who wasn't a god to stand in. If he had possessed a face capable of longing, it might have moved. As it was, a tiny quiver ran through his wing panels. For a second his geometry lost the beat. Back, Temari barked, not at him, at the sudden pressure change that made the floor think hard about other uses. Something deeper than Azoth woke up. Stone sang, not with music, with structure. A voice, like falling ice filled the crypts without needing air to carry it. Very good, it said. It wasn't anger. It wasn't praise. It was study. Bring your choir to my altar. The mural's feathers bright, Ned the color of molten brass and then went dark as if a hand had closed over a lamp. In Naruto's palm the ghost feather pricked. Not pain. Attention. Takaru, Yugito said, naming it like an oath you don't love and still keep. Karen's hand closed around Naruto's sleeve and didn't admit to the gesture. I hate disembodied men with good diction, she hissed. Hinata's fingers found Naruto's wrist. He micropressure a reminder. Don't go big first. We don't have to. I know, he said, and they both smiled at how proud they were to mean it. Azoth tilted his head back as if listening to rain. Some part of him recognized the voice as command. Another part didn't like the fit. He looked at Naruto with what, in a person, would have been called uncertainty. You're not a promise someone else wrote, Yugito said. Slanted toward him so the sentence didn't get ideas about density. You can refuse. Azoth did not answer. He turned and re-tabbed the door's geometry without touching it. He stepped through the space where stone ceased to be willful and vanished, not with a blink, the way a paragraph ends when it's done. They stood in the quiet after a bell rings and the ear hears more because of the ringing. The civilians' footsteps went away, wise and quick. Tamari pinched the bridge of her nose. We spit in the soup enough that the cook sent for us, she said. Flattering. Awful. Naruto put his palm on the mural one last time. It pressed back like a wind that had learned manners. The heat moved through his wrist into the thread burned under his skin and he didn't feel bigger. He felt more legible to himself. He swallowed around the lump that wasn't grief. We go, he said. Together. Hinata finished, because of course she did. Please, Karen said. I didn't come all this why to watch some man in a lighthouse talk about feelings without me heckling him. Yugito flexed her fingers and blue fire walked her tendons like cats. I'll stand between his mouth and your throats, she said, easy as a recipe. Tamari tapped her fan against her thigh. And I'll ruin his airflow until he admits the room belongs to us. Small first, Naruto said, more reminder than battle cry. They crossed the long hall and the last of the vow doors. This one wanted something ridiculous. I will never forget. He touched stone and corrected it. I will remember when I can, and record when I can't. The room consented with a clean click. They descended through a shaft where the light came from below. Stone became glass became something that wasn't either. Naruto felt the thread in his chest tug, not hurting, not pulling. Suggesting. The Godfall node wasn't down here like a treasure. It was up, suspended above the sea, anchored by pillars of light that had found rock to dig their heels into. Their path bent toward it. One more room stood before the stairs that went skyward, a small square with plain walls and a basin in the middle filled with water that didn't ripple. Shion sat on the ba-in's lip with her boots off and her toes in the unmoving surface, expression like a storm decided to be human because it needed hands for pointing. You're late, she said, perfectly composed and deeply annoyed. Naruto blinked. Then he grinned, boyish for the first time since the catwalk. Shion, he said, I was worried you'd be on the other side of the world being right about something. I was, she said. It bored me. Her eyes skimmed his wrist and caught the gold ghost. She made a face like she'd bitten a lemon and liked it. Prophecy says, boy of many promises becomes a cage, by the way. I came to prevent it. Yugito's mouth lifted a millimeter. Of course it does. Tamari sat on the basin's other edge like they'd planned this tableau. Got any more cheerful mail? She asked, or just the one letter? Shion rolled up the parchment she'd been toying with, tore it clean in half, and then tore it again until the words were useless. She handed the scraps to Karen, who used them as bandages for a nick on her knuckles without looking proud. I decided to make editorial corrections, Shion said primly. I don't like being told the end. Hinata's gaze warmed. We like you, she said, simple as bread. Shion looked at the mural's residue on Naruto, at Hinata's hand on his wrist, at Temari's fan and Yugito's steady fire and Karen's chain like a warning and a promise both. She sig, head like someone who had been bracing for a fight and was now bracing for a better one. Good. That makes this easier. She touched the water. It remembered how to ripple. The surface mirrored the THREE anchors of light that held the node to the world above, a triangle that should have felt stable and didn't. He'll try to make your vows his, Shion said. He's built a cup and wants your rivers. Don't pour. Small sips, Naruto said. Too quick to be clever. No bowls. Sheehan flashed teeth. Exactly. A rumble came from the stairs. Not stampede. The quiet conviction of boots that believe the floor belongs to them. Iron choir. Hazan at their throat. Naruto felt the man's timing on the air like a familiar punctuation. Karen exhaled through her nose. Time to tag the iron librarian, she purred. Temari looked at Naruto. He raised a palm, let the feather brighten a degree, and said what he could without spending too much. I'll be difficult to keep. Promise less, Hinata murmured. He did. The first two choirmen into the room did not make noise when Karen's chain wrapped their knees. The third did when Temari pressed wind into his mouth and then removed it in a way that communicated future expectations. Hazan strode in behind them, eyes sharp and not at all impressed to find them still alive. Of course, he said. Of course you collected a priestess. Cleric, Sheehan said. Priest. Is what men say when they want me to smile politely. Hazan's mouth almost twitched. He didn't allow it. His gaze settled on Naruto. You felt the nod wake. I heard it, Naruto said. It insults my singing. Hazan's hand flexed in the bandages. Good, he said. Then you're ready to be less offended. He moved for Karen. He'd been aiming for her since the moment he'd said her name at the river. Temari's wind folded the corridor just enough that his blade angle cut air and not artery. Karen flowed backward, chain lacing into a figure eight around Hazan's forearm. He stopped instead of plowing through her. He could have plowed. He didn't. The chain's seals kissed his skin and cooled. He blinked. What did you put on me? Hazan asked, conversational as ever. Karen leaned in like she wanted to bite his ear. A brand, she said. If you raise a weapon against a vessel, it hurts. Hurt how? Hazan said, genuinely interested. As if your nerves finally learned empathy, Karen said. She pulled the chain tight for a beat and let go. Try it. Hazan lifted his blade a finger's breadth. Pain hit him with no elegance, honest speed, unadorned. He didn't grunt. He did set the blade down. Good, he said through even teeth. We'll murder each other another day. You're welcome, Karen said. Sheehan slid off the basin and landed in a knee-deep ripple that didn't splash. He's calling, she said to Naruto. You can hear it. He thinks it's a dinner bell. Don't come hungry. I won't, Naruto said, and reached down to the river of his breath and drank enough to wet his tongue and no more. They climbed. The stairs opened into a throat of light. Water fell upward through it like lovers who didn't care for gravity. Naruto's ears popped twice, once for depth, once for the room, deciding it was not a room but a throat. They stepped into wind and the sky took them. The node hung over the sea like a temple inked into the air by steady hands. 3 pillars of light anchored it to the drowned city, each pulse measured like a heartbeat being timed by a physician who didn't believe in kindness. The deck was a clean geometry that made your feet itch to be messy on it. And at the center, on an altar that pretended not to be one, stood a man whose presence felt like doctrine poured into a beautiful cup. He looked human because it was useful. Takaru Otsutsuki wore a face that would have been handsome in a courtroom and forgettable in a crowd. His hair made the weather flatter itself around it. He smiled a little, like he'd won the lottery and wanted you to understand he'd always known he would. Welcome, he said, and the word fell with weight like a coin placed not tossed. Bring your choir. Naruto did. He stepped onto the deck with Yugito at one elbow and Hinata at the other end. Temari half a pace ahead because she refused to be anyone's second, and Karen dragging her chain across the floor so the altar would have to hear the sound of something honest. Sheehan walked last, eyes narrowed, mouth ready for sacrilege. Naruto didn't make his voice big. He made it true. We are not your choir, he said. We're ours. Takaru's eyes ticked with interest like a teacher meets a student who has accidentally become useful. You flatter yourself, he said, cordial. You flatter the people who stand near you. How nice. How civic. Gross, Karen murmured, which made Temari smile into her scarf like it was a sin. Takaru tipped his head at the anchor pillars with the casualness of a landlord gesturing at chandelier upgrades. This is an improvement, he said. Every promise you've ever made, wasted. Left to evaporate. I offer a reservoir. His hands widened. The altar's plates shifted with a whisper. Oaths will no longer die in private. They will be collected, held, useful. Useful to you, Yugito said. Tone a blade in its scabbard. Useful to purpose, Takaru corrected, gently. Hinata's fingers tightened a breath on Naruto's wrist. He heard her without her speaking. Don't let him name the center. We already have one. Naruto smiled, sudden and bright and small enough to keep. He looked at Hazan, who had followed at a distance as if he'd been invited to a lecture he didn't admire but took notes at anyway. Hazan lifted his wrapped hand a fraction like he was admitting the theater was good. He did not intervene. He didn't need to. Azoth stood at Takaru's left shoulder. Wings repaneled into something that looked more angel than instrument, glass face unblinking. He watched Naruto with the interest of a student who had failed a test and wanted to know why. Takaru drew breath like he was going to ask for theirs. Naruto beat him to the question. He touched the thread in his chest that their little choir had woven and felt it hum. He refused the push toward Spec. Takla and spoke the tiny promise that mattered most in this dangerous room: I will not go first. The power that lived in the feather under his skin changed flavor. It didn't swell, it spread. Hinata's line tightened in his wrist. Tamari stepped up and made the wind a shape the altar hadn't planned for. Yugito's blue fire licked the static off the node's plates and made it nervous the way lightning makes hair stand on end. Karen's chain squealed across the altar, disrespectful and cleansing. Shion chose silence on purpose and the silence wrote a blank space in Takaru's tidy math. For a second, the node did not know where to put Naruto because Naruto had moved himself off the center and then taken it with him anyway, spreading it across hands and palms and breath that had nothing to do with bows and everything to do with shared work. Takaru's smile widened a millimeter. He felt the slip. He liked the challenge. The pillars of light pulsed harder. Down below, the crypt's mural heard that pulse and warmed. Not in allegiance, recognition. The altar learned a trick and extended its reach toward the thread in Naruto's chest. Take care, Shion said, low, as if she were pointing out a wet step. He will make your kept promises into his cages. Only the big ones, Naruto said, louder, so the altar heard him being rude. We brought small. Tamari laughed once. Yugito's mouth tipped. Hinata's eyes crinkled. Karen leaned over and whispered, try not to make me cry in front of architecture. Naruto set his palm on the air and felt it push back, firm, fair. He didn't find the word that meant everything. He found the one that meant next. We're here, he said. The node answered with its entire body. The fight began like a held note that someone finally let go. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. The roar that keeps its word. The node didn't hum so much as hold its breath. Pillars of light pinned it to the world like skewers through a festival lantern, the plates of its altar shifting against each other with the expensive hush of things made by people who don't like fingerprints. Takaru stood at the center like a punctuation mark with opinions, elegant and forgettable in the way a blade L looks when someone has filed it until you can't see the edge. Bring your choir, he said again, as if hospitality were something he invented. Naruto didn't move forward. He felt Hinata's finger press once at his wrist, a tap that said, without words, small first. He made the smallest promise he had. I will keep my feet beneath me. Heat answered his ankle bones with a light, steady pressure. He rode Tamari exhale like a snort of laughter tucked behind a fan. Takaru swept a hand and the altar relayed the gesture into the pillars. Down in the drowned city, Stone remembered having been sky and wanted to be again. I collect, I anchor, he said, conversational as tea. All those vows you spill and abandon. All that energy, I will give it consequence. Everything you love about the word useful, Yugito said, not a question. Civic, he agreed, smiling a shade. Faith without waste, Karen grimaced. You scooped morality out with a spoon and kept the dish. If it keeps children from droning under bridges made by men who promise too much, Takaru spread his hands. I'll take the dish. Hinata slid a step so the line of her shoulder brushed Naruto's. Her eyes were pale with Byakugan and soft with the other kind. The one that reads when a door is asking for humility. He's pulling on any pledge in range, she murmured. Wide net. It tightens when we say, always, never, or, mine. Tamari didn't wait for a signal. She shoved her fan open and cut a seam into the air so narrow it looked like a note. Wind ran through the node wrong. Plates that wanted laminar flow got eddies instead. Takaru's smile thinned. Not anger, Interest. Azoth took one step forward, wing panels recalibrating with the quiet click of a mind moving pieces. Lightning's baptism had left one half of his face sheer as glass. It reflected Naruto's small shape back at him. Center, Azoth said, like a man tasting a word he'd only read. Group. Good, Naruto said, not unkind. Hold that thought. The first wave of choir came like an expectation. Long knives lifted just enough to make the altar take them seriously. Hazan wasn't among them. Naruto felt the shape of the man's timing anyway, a footnote Penchi. Led at the page bottom that admitted, later. Naruto touched the rail with 2 fingers, the way he would greet a friend in a crowd so he didn't have to shout. Covenant of Relay, he said, to Hinata's B1's and Temari's wrists and Yugito's steady breath and Karen's bad temper. The thread ran, thin and gold, across skin that had agreed to be in the same sentence. It tightened. Karen hissed, warn me, and tapped a seal into the altar's seam so the echo ran through paper instead of ribs. Takaru lifted his hands like a conductor inviting the orchestra to remember they were here for him. The pillars answered. The light bent nearer to his skin than light should. You see how quick you are to make yourselves into a network, he said, smiling like a teacher praising a dangerous child for a correct answer. How natural to become part of a larger intention. Intention is fine, Temari said, bright with spite. Ownership is gross. He flicked his fingers. The node listened with all its ears. An LD vow Naruto had once made to a boy in a flooded street, I'll be back before the kettle cools, rose out of his chest and tugged like a fish on a line. The altar wanted it, not to annul it, to keep it, to file it under a name that wasn't Naruto. No, Naruto said, aloud and to himself, smaller than the pull. He changed the tense. I returned. He gave that kept promise to the people who'd lived it with him. Not to the cup Takaru held out like a priest asking for confession and keeping the coins. The tug went slack. The altar tasted it and learned nothing. Azoth's head tipped a fraction. Parameter slip, he murmured. The choir crashed on the wind Temari had made unfriendly. Their feathersteel sang when it kissed the node plates. The metal, trained to ignore weather's whims, wanted to ignore this altar too, and did. Until Karen slapped a chain around a wrist and dragged geometry into rudeness. Feathersteel's frequency, she said through her teeth, rhymes with his reservoir. I hate that for us. She changed the angle of her seal by a hair and the chain's brand warmed. Not for him. A blade slid for Naruto's ribs, neat and unambitious. Hinata's palm met it halfway, fingers precise, turning the hand without shattering the arm behind it. Smaller, she breathed, and Naruto trimmed the relay thread until it sat snug instead of slack. The pinch in his chest eased like a stitch someone had noticed and rubbed away. Yugito stepped forward into a space Azoth had tried to quantize. Blue flame sketched the grid's edges and then refused to let them own the room. You trained the world to click, she said. We prefer swing. Azoth reached for her again, not to break, to correct. She let him touch air and not skin. No, she said again. It was becoming a sentence the grid learned to respect. Takaru finished listening to their refusals and set both hands on the altar. The plates sighed. Down in the crypts, the mural warmed again, not in obedience, recognition. Enough, he said, not raising his voice. The node re-centered on him like a compass dropped on a slab of iron. You are wasteful. You pour in the sand. I collect into a sea. It's cleaner this way. Then why are you here talking to us instead of to that sea? Temari asked, and let the wind laugh for her. Because some rivers don't like dams, he said, smiling almost kindly. And some dams need a hand. Lightning walked itself through Azoth's wing panels. He moved. Naruto felt a crispness enter the moment, that unkind clarity when a fight stops being theory and becomes this swing, this foot, this breath. Azoth cut the relay. Karen's chain shredded a slice of it into harmlessness. Hinata's fingers found Naruto's shoulder knot and eased the rest. Takaru lifted the altar's plates like a clerk opening a drawer in the room filled with numbers. Oaths made elsewhere twisted toward him in thin threads. I will return. I won't drink tonight. I swear I'll be there. I promise I won't. The node didn't care which were good or foolish. It cared that they were available. Shion chose silence on purpose and the silence warped the math. The altar reached for her to categorize it and found nothing to hold. She smiled like some One who had kept a secret river out of a census. You don't get my ending, she told Takaru. You don't even get my commas. Naruto stepped out of the center he loved. He placed it across shoulders he trusted. Tamari, he said. Architecture. She didn't answer. She drew wind through the anchor pillars in a pattern that made them forget they were supposed to be obedient. Two cooled, one heated. The difference created a corridor. Yugito, Naruto said. On it, she said, and blue fire ran the corridor like a runner who knew every bump in the road. It met Naruto's gold as it came and neither swallowed the other. The seam where they touched became a blade that wasn't a blade, a line that ate invariance without gloating. Azoth swung into it. He wasn't human enough to hesitate, he was learning enough to acknowledge surprise. When blue gold kissed his wing, the grid snapped out of true. Rain stopped ticking in squares. It began to fall like weather. Sun cat, Yugito murmured, and Naruto laughed once, helpless and proud. Hinata called strain the way she named bones. Left anchor flirting with failure. If you push there, no, there. Copy, Naruto said, and pushed where she pointed. A press of the palm no bigger than a breath. The anchor shifted. The node frowned in metal. Takaru blinked, a man recalculating tip percentages for a table that kept adding guests. The smile didn't leave his mouth. It retreated behind his eyes. You are sentimental, he told Naruto. You mistake dispersal for virtue. No, Naruto said, I refuse to starve my friends because it's tidy. You'll break, Takaru said. He lifted his hands to the sea. Threads tightened, a million tiny wants pulled taut. You promise too much. Naruto felt the altar reach for that old, hungry sentence in him. He touched it, not to deny it, to edit it. I promise enough people, he said, softly, committing the grammar. Heat lit his palm. The feather under his skin flared and then settled, not a brand, sheet music. He could have made the grand vow. He didn't. He took the stupid, punishing one because Karen had been right. You don't pin these to banners. No one dies, he said, and then before the node could snap the trap. He broke it into 1,000 pieces and threw them where hands could keep them. He named the people he could reach. Names are a kind of promise too. He sent a piece to the Kumo engineers who, GGing each other on a rung 100 meters down. No one dies, here, in this minute, with this grip. He sent a piece to the Sand Rangers Tamari had called off book. No one dies on that pass while you hold it. He felt Anbu teams far away flicker, curious, skeptical, and then accept a shard like good soldiers taking ration packets from a stranger with honest eyes. He even tossed one to Hazan, wherever he was drawing a bead, for one breath. As you aim, no one dies in your line. The dome that rose was mosaic, not monolith. If you looked for a single sheen you missed it. If you looked at the shine in 100 tesserae, you saw the shape. The node reached to seize and found too many pieces willing to be separate together. Pain lanced Naruto's shoulder where he'd burnt before. He swayed. Karen's slap. Pet a seal over the scar like a rude kiss. The feedback slowed from a scream to a sermon. Breathe through your nose, you heroic idiot, she snarled, and then, gentler, smaller. We'll keep the corners while you keep the center. Hinata's hand was on his wrist. Calibration, ritual, now, and the pressure there made his chest decide to behave. Tamari didn't look at him. She ruined a wind line that Takaru had hidden under a prettier one. Yugito cut the ribbon the ruin revealed. Shion refused to bless the moment and the moment stayed free. Azoth stepped in again and again learned that a lack of EXPR. Eshin does not protect you from surprise. He reached past Naruto for the pillar, to make the promise lattice retune. Yugito was suddenly there, steady, palm open between his hand and the altar. She didn't block, she shared heat. You don't have to be a promise someone else wrote, she said. Not a slogan, an option. Azoth's hand hovered a breath. He would have counted the breath, had he been built for lungs. He did something more difficult. Nothing. A new motion cracked the hush. Hazan arrived on a cable that didn't know what gravity owed anyone. He swung under the altar, popped up on the far flank like a fish deciding to be a bird for a joke, and threw his knife at Takaru's throat with the lazy accuracy of a man who had been aiming for the last 2 hours. Karen's brand did not burn him. He wasn't raising steel at a vessel. Or maybe the brand new vessel isn't always the man who says he is. Either way, the pain didn't come. Takaru moved his head a fraction, not because he'd seen Hazan so much as because his math had. The blade cut a shallow frown at his jaw and went on. Hazan was already stepping toward the second throw when Azof's wing cut the line on principle. Hazan switched grip with the ease of a man swapping hands at a grip strength contest and smiled politely into Azof's face as if he'd been expecting to meet a stranger in a hall and was pleased to find him interesting. You helped build a net for words, Hazan said conversationally even as he flicked a feather steel filament up to bite an altar seam. Let's see what it holds. Azoth put his hand on the filament. It should have cut. It stopped. Not because feather steel had quit its job, but because the man touching it had adjusted the parameter by a width so small nobody sane would have noticed. Naruto noticed. Yugito did too. The filament didn't slice the hand. It recorded the hand. Azoth let it. Karen's mouth opened to say a thing she'd never admit sounded like pride. Takaru, for the first time, looked briefly annoyed. Rain beaded on his hair. It did not cling. This is a rehearsal, he said, polite again. You will tire. I won't. Then let's be efficient, Tamari said, and the wind said something startlingly obscene in support. The altar learned their rhythm. It aimed at Naruto. Everything does, eventually. The plate under his left foot changed friction like an argument mid-sentence. The pillar pulsed a beat off, tugging his breath toward a pace that would thin him out. The old, hungry sentence rose again. Promise everything, and with it the heat that comes before a person burns. Hinata didn't raise her voice. Smaller. He took the instruction like a man taking a cup from a friend's hand before he spills the kettle. He cut the vow into a slice he could chew without hating himself. Protect, he said. Not everyone. Not forever. The altar tried to read it and found the word had been tuned to the frequency of a palm on a shoulder in a tunnel and a hand on a rail in a storm and a kneecap bump on a catwalk. The node couldn't file it. It wasn't data. It was a memory with teeth. He stepped. It wasn't a leap. It wasn't a beam. The air remembered the staircase he'd made on the night Hazan had learned his name. He walked down the sky, each footfall a promise with a subject and a verb and a single object that could be defended. Return, he said, and the step he had just left held for Temari's boot, not his. Listen, he said, and the wind didn't just move. Tamari asked it to move and it agreed. Share, he said, and the gold in his palm threaded into Yugito's knuckles without hierarchy. The blue burning through it with approval instead of conquest. Enough, Takaru said, and reached to take. Shion mixed another silence. You don't pour quiet like water. You fold it like cloth. And lay it over something that needs a minute. She laid it over Naruto's next step and the altar grabbed at a nothing so complete it had to respect it or go mad. It chose respect. Takaru's hand closed on air he couldn't name. The node panicked in the smallest possible way. It retreated to comfort. Centralization. When frightened, control freaks straightened their desks. The pillars brightened. The plates shivered. Every thread in the room, even the mosaic dome shards, felt a tug toward the altar. Naruto let himself be pulled 1 inch and then planted his heel. I won't go first, he repeated, and felt the line answer with relief. He put Hinata forward, not as a shield, as the person who knew when strain would be kindness if you adjusted it. She didn't argue the honor. She stepped, a Byakugan, sure foot into a space nobody else could have known was sound. It unthreaded something that had no business unraveling. Takaru's smile broke like a surface skin on warm milk. He didn't lose composure. He lost inevitability. Azoth raised a hand as if to choose sides. Blue fire touched his wrist without burning. Yugito looked at him the way you look at a feral animal that has stopped pretending it isn't listening. Boundary, she said again, a word offered to a machine as a way out of prayer. His hand paused. When it came down, it did not fall on Naruto. Hazan took the inch his moment had bought. He stepped past Azoth's wing with honest grace and put feathersteel across the altar's seam so quick the node didn't get to tell that particular sentence it wasn't allowed. The seam opened the width of a breath. Naruto stepped into it. Takaru lifted both hands to fix the misbehavior. Karen's chain kissed his wrist with the brand of a woman who has been underestimated enough for one lifetime. Pain hit Takaru's borrowed nerves. He didn't cry out. His pupils narrowed an honest fraction. This, he said, like a disappointed uncle seeing a scuffed shoe, is why the world deserves me. No, Naruto said, and felt suddenly absurdly calm. He could taste the salt off the sea and the iron off the plates and something like cedar in Shien's parchment scraps on Karen's fingers. The world deserves a better memory than one man's account. He set his palm to the node for the last time and spoke the vows he'd decided to keep lower than speeches. Protect. The anchor pillar held when it wanted to bend. It did not become a cage. It became a shoulder. Return. The thread he'd laid into Kumo engineers fluttered once, reporting in, and went steady. Listen. Hinata's hand tightened. He felt her read a strain in his ribs and tap it smooth because listening is sometimes obedience to someone you love. Share. The heat spilled, not into a reservoir with a landlord, but into hands ready to carry a corner of the table. Tamari took hers like a dance partner. Yugito took hers like a way she respected. Karen took hers with a complaint and didn't let go. Shien didn't take heat at all. She refused the parameter. The refusal wrote room. The node learned. You could feel it. The click where a machine acknowledges an error and bumps it into a category of exceptions. Takaru's face didn't change. His fingertips did. The nails bit his own palms. He didn't enjoy this part. Do you think there will be feasts in your honor for this? He asked softly. Songs. You break a single altar and call it virtue. You are noise. Naruto smiled in a way that would have embarrassed him in any other room. No feasts, he said. Small meals. A lot of them. With people who keep their dishes. He pushed. Not hard. On time. The altar's plates shifted up and apart like a flock startled into air, not shattered, not murdered. Released. The pillars unbraided. The light dropped in sheets that turned to feathers before they hit the sea, then to sparks. Then to nothing. Down in the crypts, the mural lit once, gold like bruised dawn, and then the light soaked into stone like warmth into bread. The feathers that had been. And the node's lie fell across the world in ways nobody could catalog. A shrine that would sing when a midwife promised to do one more hour in a town with no doctor, a chime in a shed when two boys SW. Or to stop calling their little sister names, a dome no bigger than a hat when a fisherman chose to keep a vow to himself about not drinking until after the net was mended. No reservoir, no tithe, 1,000 bowls in 1,000 kitchens. Azoth staggered. He didn't seem to understand that the deck had kept its shape. He put a hand on the air like a person who does not trust floors. Center lost, he said. He made no move to rebuild it. Takaru raised his hands to begin again and found himself too late. Hazan's second throw finally arrived at the exact angle he'd been riding on the air since they stepped onto this sky. Takaru turned his head so it wouldn't take his eye. It took his hair. He looked offended and then very briefly, truly alive. Very good, he said, faint admiration or a note-taking habit. He stepped back as if to invite another throw. He wasn't retreating. He was removing himself from a room that had stopped being calibrated to his liking. Next time, he said, not promising, not threatening, logging. Bring more rivers. No, Naruto said, and found himself laughing, a little, with an exhaustion that felt like friendship. Bring more cups. Takaru moved into the gap where the pillar had been. A step that wasn't a step. The sky didn't swallow him. He simply wasn't there in the way a sentence isn't in the room once someone has said it and no longer needs to. Hazan looked at the place where the man had been and put his blade away with the restrained annoyance of a calligrapher whose ink has run out. He turned, wrapped hand lifted an inch, a nod to the altar, or the boy, or the room. Karen's brand smoldered under his skin a degree darker, not punishing him for his choice so much as reminding him it remembered. He gave Naruto a single look with a question inside it. Later, Naruto said, and Hazan's mouth moved a sliver like he couldn't help agreeing. He pivoted and walked to the edge of a world that was busy being itself again and stepped down a cable into weather. The choir, those who could, chose to be anywhere else. Their knives remembered wallets and wives. Yugito stood with her hands at her sides, blue fire snuffed. She looked at Azoth. He looked back with a face that couldn't register surprise yet and did it anyway in the way a grid slumps by a millimeter when you take weight off it. You don't belong to him, she said. But you can choose to belong to something. Azoth pointed straight down. Gravity, he said, a proposal. Start there, she said. The altar settled into being a deck no better or worse than wood. The pillars, afterglow raw, end back into the sea like a joke someone told and then forgot while laughing. Xian slid her bare feet on the smooth plate as if checking for sandpaper splinters. The prophecy stopped at this room, she said. I like that. Means I get to write the part where we climb down and breathe and nobody sings a bad song about us. Tamari leaned her hip on the rail and looked out over the light spitting itself into feathers. No song can keep a beat like that, she said. Then, wry but honest, good work, choir boy. Don't, Naruto protested, cheerful, because Karen was already preparing a remark. Choir boy, she echoed, satisfied. I told you. Hinata's fingers were still on his wrist. She had never squeezed. She had never needed to. She let go now, and in the space where her hand had been he felt not loss, but proof that he had been held. He touched the back of her hand awkwardly. Awkward didn't mean clumsy. It meant not treating a thing like a trick. I promised small, he said. You did, she said. Her smile cleaned the air. And you kept it. He looked at Yugito. She lifted her chin. At Tamari, who cocked an eyebrow. Smaller first, more often. At Karen, who rolled her shoulder to shish. Him he would be deeply stupid ever to try taking everything on himself in her presence. At Xian, who waved away the sky and looked at the stair. I'll argue with the first person who tries to call this the day we saved the world. She said, we saved a room. 2, if you count the bridge. Maybe 3, if someone down there kept their dish from breaking. 3's a lot, Tamari said. For people who started as 4 and change. Azoth stood very still, calculating. Then, in a gesture that had to have been copied from someone else, he bowed. It was off by 3 degrees and happened 2 beats too late. Naruto returned it without laughing because respect becomes a language faster if you don't treat it like a game. Azoth straightened, glanced up, and tried a new sentence. I will not go first, he said. Perfect, Yugito said quietly. They climbed down out of the sky. The node's throat did not try to argue its way into altar again. It let them go. Good rooms do when you've finished what you came to do. At the basin, Xian wrung her skirt and then pointed imperiously at Naruto's ribs. Show me. It's fine, he began. She glared like the moon cross-examining the sea. He lifted his shirt. The cut was a polite mouth where Feathersteel had kissed him rudely. Karen had sealed it with something that smelled like bitter tea and faith. Xian looked at the sealed wound, at the feather under his skin. At the way Hinata's posture admitted she knew exactly how close he'd sailed to the burn and had chosen not to scold because scolding isn't a break. She made a face like the lemon again and liked it again. You'll die if you talk like a god to every hallway, she said. It will kill you kindly, which is worse. I'll keep it small, he said. He meant it. It didn't feel like settling. It felt like a way to avoid drowning in rooms he couldn't name. Good, she said. Now eat something ugly. They ate crab that had made a bad decision and bread that had been bullied into texture by someone's patient hands. They sat on the step where the light-laden stairs met ordinary stone and let their chests decide where to put air. The civilians they'd freed had already gone. That was the right shape for a victory. Hazan, somewhere on an offshore platform, watched the sky shed feathers as if a giant bird had laughed itself apart. He flexed his wrapped hand and felt Karen's brand as a fact, not a punishment. He would come again. He told himself that. He made no promise out loud, because making promises in a world that had learned to notice them felt like respecting an ancient animal with its head on your lap. On the broken aqueduct, the statue that had never been an angel and had been pretending not to be a ruin considered having something to do again. A gull landed on its shoulder and stole the idea, the way ghouls do. And the statue was content to watch. The ruined city didn't thank them. It didn't have to. Old places don't applaud. They keep standing. Night retreated with bad grace. Dawn pressed its thumbprint on the horizon. Naruto stretched his hand and watched the feather under his skin dim to something you could mistake for a shadow if you had poor lighting and worse imagination. He found Hinata's eyes and tilted his head at the path up. She nodded. Yugito yawned and pretended she hadn't. Tamari twirled her fan once, the extravagant flourish she only allowed herself. When nobody could accuse her of having a heart. Karen laced her chain into a coil and hooked it at her hip like you hang a towel after a shower. Breakfast in Suna, Tamari suggested. Then we preden. To be polite long enough to make my brother write me a letter saying he hates that I was right. Kumo first, Yugito said. I owe a report with footnotes. I will be nowhere near any of your kitchens, Karen said. I will be in a bath. Quote, she inflicted a drop of water at Naruto's nose. And I will go find the man who wrote, Boy of Many Promises becomes a cage, and make him say sorry with bread offerings. Hinata tugged Naruto's sleeve. We'll stop in the village, she said. The researchers will give us tea that tastes like boiled guilt. Perfect, Yugito said. They stood. Naruto looked back. Once at the place where the node had been an altar. Feather dust. Light, not ash, still drifted in the air like things that belonged to nobody and everyone. He made a last promise so small he almost didn't notice saying it. I'll be here when you call, he said to the room that wasn't a room anymore. He meant the city. He meant the people who'd go on humming down here without him. He meant the next stranger on a catwalk in somebody else's rain, counting his steps so he didn't fall. The air didn't answer. It didn't have to. They walked out under fern and ruin, through morning that had finally remembered how to be day. The boatman with the wet grin watched the way people who traffic in thresholds watch, admiring, amused, a little bored. He didn't ask what had happened. Naruto didn't tell him. They had a transaction. Bodies into boats, boats into water, water into wake. Out past the broken ribs, the ocean moved like a thing that had watched empires become stories and stories become dinner table arguments. Feathers of light landed on it, dissolved, and left behind the faintest ripples, names not anyone's to keep. Hinata sat shoulder to shoulder with Naruto because the bench was narrow and because it would have been silly to pretend it wasn't what they both wanted. Tamari put her feet up on the gunwale like a criminal daring arrest. Yugito closed her eyes for 2 breaths and then opened them and looked more awake. Karen let her head fall back until her hair trailed a little in the wind and muttered, gross, like a prayer. Shion made a paper boat out of prophecy scraps and set it on the water. It sank perfectly. Naruto looked down at his palm. The feather was a pencil line and a pulse. He flexed his fingers and a little warmth answered, not possessive, not needy, present. You'll make more promises, Hinata said. She didn't make it sound like a warning. I'll make smaller ones, he said. You'll share them, Tamari added, chin tilted high, because she could not be stopped from adding edits to structural plans. And you'll let us tell you when you're being stupid, Karen said, friendly as a thrown shoe. I will drink water before the fight, Yugito observed. He saluted them all. Deal. Look at you, Shion said, learning. He grinned because he couldn't not. It's the only way to write good endings, he said. Together and by accident, the boat cut a line through the hum of a city that had decided to keep its own memory. Above them, the sky carried no altar, just weather. Somewhere beyond that, a man who liked the idea of reservoirs would be building another cup and calling it different. That would be later's problem. For now, there were small promises to keep, and tea to drink that tasted like boiled guilt, and friends who would make faces at him if he got precious. He liked those odds. The sea breathed. He breathed with it. The day took them in. Chapter 5 End.